Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the June Mid-Atlantic Council meeting here in lovely Virginia Beach. Skip, you did great with the weather. Let's start with Unmanaged Commercial Landings Report. Julia Beatty will give us a review on the annual report of unmanaged commercial landings. And we will also online, Sarah Turner will assist with the report if anything needs help with. Julia, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. So yes, Sarah Turner with Garfo did a lot of the number crunching for this report. So I want to definitely acknowledge her contributions. And as the chair mentioned, she can help out with questions if needed. I'm sorry, the clicker is not on. So the objectives for this discussion are to review the update to the report and just to provide any feedback. No specific action is necessarily required today, but feedback could take the form of things like any questions you have or anything that you think should be further evaluated, anything that might be of concern, or any potential improvements for future reports. So first, I will go into a little bit of background on why the council gets these reports. So these reports are a follow-on action from the Unmanaged Forage Omnibus Amendment, which the council took final action on in 2016. The goal of that amendment was to prohibit the development of new and expansion of existing directed commercial fisheries for unmanaged forage species in mid-Atlantic federal waters, but not indefinitely, only until the council had the adequate opportunity to both assess the scientific information relating to any new or expanded directed fisheries and consider potential impacts to existing fisheries, fishing communities, and the marine ecosystem. So through this amendment, the council sought to protect the structure and function of marine ecosystems from the potential threat of unregulated, unsustainable levels of commercial harvest of forage species and to advance an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. So the way that the council practically went about doing that was to establish a commercial possession limit for over 50 species that were previously unmanaged in mid-Atlantic federal waters. So the list on the screen here shows the species and species groups that this applies to. So it's a 1,700-pound possession limit of combined weight of all of these species for commercial fisheries in mid-Atlantic federal waters. This possession limit has been in place since September of 2017 was when it was implemented. But it's important to note that this list on the screen here doesn't cover every single previously unmanaged species. It was focused on forage species and species that were considered to be of most concern for the council or had some kind of link to the council managed species. So there could be other species that could be unmanaged, that could have increasing landings. And then even with this 1,700-pound possession limit, maybe there's still the potential to increase beyond historical levels with that, because it wasn't intended to kind of restrict any landings below historical levels. So given all that, the council has asked for these annual updates on unmanaged commercial landings of all species. And the first version of this report was provided to the council in 2018, and we've done it annually since then, and we hopefully make some improvements every year. They've evolved a little bit over time. But the goal of these unmanaged commercial landings reports is to monitor for signs of developing unmanaged commercial fisheries in the mid-Atlantic. New or growing fisheries could develop in response to changing species distributions, changing markets, changes in other fisheries, or for other reasons. It's important to note that increasing landings don't necessarily indicate an ecological issue or a need for management. And these summaries are meant to be a high-level summary to determine if further evaluation is needed. So last year, the council also had some discussions about, are there any specific metrics that would trigger further evaluations? And after discussing it with the EOP, AP, and committee, the council decided not to kind of come up with any specific metrics to trigger further evaluation, but rather to kind of look at everything more holistically and think about things on a case-by-case basis. So for the purposes of this report, as a reminder, unmanaged means that the species does not have a commercial possession limit, size limit, seasonal closure, or limited access. And this applies only in the locations where this is true. So we reach out to the states every year states of Maine through North Carolina, and we ask for updates on commercial management measures. So there's the species in the report, it's only showing landings in locations where it doesn't have at least one of these things at the state or federal level. So for example, if a state has something like a general commercial harvest permit that's open access, anybody can get it. Maybe it has a reporting requirement, but it doesn't have a possession limit or size limit, seasonal closure, or limited access, then it counts as unmanaged. And a new addition for this year's version of the report is there's an appendix that lists everything that's in all the tables. It shows kind of state by state where things are filtered out, because sometimes we get questions about, I know this species is managed in my state, so are the landings in this report showing my state? And you can look at that appendix to see what's filtered out at the individual state level. And it also has some other common names and scientific names if you're unsure what the names in the report are referring to. And as a reminder, the data come from the Catch Accounting and Monitoring System, or CAMS, and it does include both federal and state dealer reports. So that was a question we sometimes got in the past, is are we pulling in the state dealer data? And we are through CAMS. And it also pulls in information from commercial vessel trip reports. So we do think the data are fairly comprehensive. Another new addition for this year's report is we just took all the unmanaged landings and added them up together to show trends in the total amount of unmanaged landings over time based on, the definition of the unmanaged species that make it into the report. So this figure is showing those totals over the past 10 years. And you can see that just focusing on 2024, it's 8.4 million pounds. And this is, Maine through North Carolina. And you can also see that that's lower. It's the lowest number on the time series here. And a lot of the species that are in that, make it into this report, they did have lower landings in 2024 compared to 2023. About half of the species that make it into the report had lower landings in 2024. So the 2024 decline, it's not like it was driven by a few species. It was kind of across the board, the high number of species. You can also see here that 2015 through 2018 had generally higher unmanaged landings than 2019 through 2024. That was also driven by multiple species, but a big difference across those two time blocks is blue mussel landings. For whatever reason, there was a much higher blue mussel landings in those earlier years than in the lower years. So the next table, well, I don't have it in the presentation, but table 1 in the report shows the top 30 species by weight of unmanaged landings. And that's a kind of overwhelming amount of information to digest. So I didn't put it in the PowerPoint, but it's in the briefing materials if you want to look at it. So instead in the PowerPoint, I'm just going to focus on some highlights of things that, could potentially stand out or potentially be of interest to the council. And again, the council hasn't established any specific metrics to prioritize, but in recent years, we've highlighted things like what's on the screen here, which is which species are in the top 10 for unmanaged commercial landings each year over the most recent 5 years. And for this year's version of the report, that includes blue mussel, hagfish. This year we combined conchs and whelks because after some discussion with some AP members and some state partners, we think that a lot of what was reported as some conch species are actually whelks, because conch is a common name that also refers to whelk. So we combined those in the report. Also, Atlantic cutlass fish was in the top 10 each year over the most recent 5 years. King whiting, which has a number of other common names that are in the appendix, and sugar kelp. And so the blue highlighting are for the species that are on this table that have at least 10% of their unmanaged commercial landings in mid-Atlantic states and associated with federal permits. And that's just a judgment call that staff made to kind of highlight things that might be of most relevance to the council, trying to keep it as like a low threshold of 10%. And with the, presumption that if things are mostly being landed in New England states or mostly with state permits, that's kind of outside the authority of the council, the Mid-Atlantic Council anyway. So just highlighting things that could potentially be of most interest to the Mid-Atlantic Council. Another way to look at things that could be of interest is species that have increasing or stable rank order over time. So the way we calculate this is each year we rank species from what had the highest to lowest unmanaged commercial landings and look at those that are increasing in their rank order over time, which means that their landings are increasing relative to other species. So this is showing those species that had increasing or stable rank order over the most recent 5 years. And then the numbers in bold in parentheses are the rank each year. So you can see in 2024, that combined grouping of conch and whelk had the highest unmanaged commercial landings. And so conch and whelk, Atlantic cutlassfish, king whiting, and almaco jack are the species that had increasing or stable rank order in the most recent 5 years. Most of those are the same as what was on the previous table. Almaco jack is the only species that shows up on this table, but not the prior table. But those landings were virtually all from state permits. So again, presumably of less concern to the Mid-Atlantic Council. And then we've also been including tables in recent years about species that had increasing landings kind of regardless of the scale of the increase. And so that's what this table shows. Species that had increasing landings each year from 2021 through 2024. We used a little bit of a shorter time series for this one because there's not that many species that have consistently increasing landings every single year for many years in a row. So you can see what shows up here are black dogfish, red porgy, almaco jack, big eye, and the squirrelfish family. And again, the brighter blue color is highlighting those that had at least 10% of those unmanaged landings in the most recent 5 years in Mid-Atlantic states and federal permits. So you can see there were some big increases percentage-wise, but overall the landings are still pretty low. So if you look at big eye, it went from 249 pounds in 2023 to about 5,000 pounds in 2024, which is like a massive percentage increase, but still pretty low overall. So don't necessarily see anything of huge concern in the table here, but again, that's something that the council should think about and weigh in on. And then the reports also show landings of those species that are part of the forage amendment. Again, there was over 50 species that are part of that amendment, but most of them don't actually show up in the landings data. So this is showing a slightly abbreviated version of a table in the report. There were a few more species that had either 0 or confidential landings in each of the last 10 years that I didn't put in the PowerPoint, but they're in the report. So you can see that overall, these landings are generally low and they're pretty variable. Of these species, silversides had the highest averaged unmanaged commercial landings at about 83,000 pounds per year over the most recent 10 years. In recent years, most of the unmanaged commercial silverside landings are occurring in Mid-Atlantic states because there are a few New England states that have management. But nearly all of those landings in recent years are associated with state permits. And then, other species here, the unclassified herrings are mostly occurring in New England with federal permits. The thread herring landings are they're in Mid-Atlantic and New England and have both state and federal permits. Round herring is mostly in New England with federal permits. And again, everything else for the ecosystem component species had much lower levels of landing, so are assumed to be of less concern to the council. So this year we got the report ready a little bit earlier than normal so we could send it to the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee and Advisory Panel just so they could have more time to look at it and provide comments and suggested edits. Again, the combination of conch and whelk in this year's report came out of some comments that an advisor made to help us think about that. But one advisor provided some more detailed comments on sea robins. And this advisor said that when he goes recreationally fishing for summer flounder off of New Jersey, he commonly catches sea robins and he mostly throws them back. And every once in a while he keeps them for bait, but they're mostly just a bycatch that he throws back. And he's noticed that he's caught fewer sea robins in recent years than he had in the past. And he noted that table 1 in the report shows declining unmanaged commercial landings, which is what that row of numbers is on the bottom there. So he noticed that and he said, is this related to me catching fewer sea robins as bycatch? Like, are there fewer sea robins out there? And given that he catches them as bycatch when he's targeting summer flounder, and there's concerns about the summer flounder stock status right now, he questions if that's related. Are the declines in summer flounder and sea robins related, given that they share habitat and forage species? This advisor also asked, could there be something that's impacting both of them, suggesting potentially commercial overfishing, but staff are not aware of any analysis about sea robins in general. They don't have a stock assessment, or we don't have like an established method for like looking at sea robin abundance over time. So we're not aware of any existing analysis to point to this. Sea robins are a top bycatch species in several council managed fisheries, including commercial longfin squid and commercial and recreational summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. Tori helped me out by looking at some trends in sea robin catches in fisheries independent trawl surveys. So this is showing 17 different fishery independent surveys that happen across the coast. And there's actually 16 different sea robin species that are caught across all of these surveys. And the unmanaged commercial landings report just says sea robin, so we don't know what species are making that up. But the most commonly caught in the trawl surveys are northern sea robin and striped sea robin. So that's what this figure is showing. Northern sea robin in the reddish color and striped sea robin in the tealish color. So I don't know what we can take from this information. It's showing variable trends. Maybe there's some declining trends, but it kind of varies by trawl survey. So just kind of wanted to point that out as something that's out there that we looked into in response to an advisor comment. So conclusions in terms of the unmanaged landings report is that, again, just to reiterate that the council doesn't have a specific threshold of landings that would trigger further evaluation or of concern, but just based on the information in the report and feedback that we've heard, staff suggests that none of the landings in the report are likely to be of immediate concern for the council, but, obviously want to hear from you today if you think otherwise. It might be worth continuing to monitor Atlantic cutlass fish and then the conch and whelk landings, because each of those species had at least 1 million pounds in at least one recent year. At least half of the landings are in the mid-Atlantic, and at least 10% of those landings are coming from federal permits. I will say with the conch and whelk category, it's pretty close to 10% federal permits, so it's still mostly state. But something to think about if the council is, interested in that. And then lastly, on a slightly different but related topic, you might have noticed in the supplemental briefing materials that Garfo has communicated to the council that they received an exempted fishing permit application for neon flying squid, which is one of the forage amendment ecosystem component species. So the process for exempted fishing permit applications includes publishing a Federal Register notice with a comment period for applications that are deemed complete. And so that Federal Register notice has not yet published, but when it does, the council may wish to comment, given that it's an ecosystem component species. And based on what Garfo communicated about what is in the proposal, that it would request a possession limit of 10,000 pounds of neon flying squid for, it appears like just a few trips, and that the vessels would use automatic jigging machines. And the current possession limit, again, is 1,700 pounds, so that's why it requires an exemption. So mostly this is just to give the council a heads up that there might be a comment period coming soon. And also to remind you that a few years ago, the council adopted this guidance document for council review of exempted fishing permit applications for the forage amendment ecosystem component species. And through that guidance document, the council kind of established that they want kind of a more thorough review of EFP applications for these species specifically. The council did request that EFP applications for these species be sent to the council prior to or at the same time as Garfo, which was not done in this case. It also requests that GARFO refrain from publishing the Federal Register notice until after the SSC and the EOP, AP, and committee have had a chance to review the application. And then the guidance document also lists a number of additional pieces of information that the council would like to see in these applications for these forage amendment species beyond what's required for all EFP applications. So that includes things like more details on expected harvest and discards of all species, expected impacts on the ecosystem, procedures for monitoring all catch, and a recommendation for biological sampling. But also it's important to note that this guidance document is not binding on GARFO. It doesn't change the official requirements for the process for EFP applications. So EFP applicants don't have to follow any of these steps. It's just something that the council has recommended. That's all I had. Happy to take any questions. And again, the objective is just to kind of discuss if there's anything in the unmanaged landings report for this year that you have any questions about or concerns about, or you want to dig in a little further.
Thank you, Julia. Jim Gilmore.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and great report, Julia. I actually have two questions, but I'll preface them by, years ago when we were trying to manage conch and whelk, I asked my staff for a simpler name for it so we could refer to it better, and they came up with carnivorous gastropods. So we stuck with conch and whelk. So first one is just a clarifying question. So you said that unmanaged species were ones that didn't have the one of those things, that first slide with the 4 points. And I believe for conch and whelk, we have size limits in all the states. Connecticut and New York were a little late to the dance for whatever reason, but we do have size limits now. So I'm not, and I'm completely okay with having them included. It's just that it didn't seem to fit that criteria. So just so you know, I believe that all the states now have a size limit, including Connecticut and New York. So is that's correct now? Then that should be, they do meet that criteria, I'm assuming.
That's good to know. I can double check with the states, but right now they're only filtered out in New Jersey. But every year I reach out to the states so I can, double check, like, hey, could we send them like a long list and say, are there any changes to this? Maybe it just got missed, or, but we can confirm that. And also if anybody has anything else like that to look into, that's helpful. And then also there's an appendix in the report that lists other common names. So if you have any suggestions for other things that should be on that list, like whatever you think would be relevant, because there's definitely some species in here that we get questions about. What is that? And obviously I don't know all the common names that are used everywhere, but those are useful suggestions too.
And that being said, I still think conch and whelk should stay on the list for because of its history. And just a brief thing in the background of that, we went several years ago at ASMFC, and we tried to do a management plan through the commission for conch and whelk, and there was some, and primarily because a lot of, particularly in Long Island Sound, the lobster fishery had collapsed, and a lot of the guys that had been fishing for lobster switched over to conch and whelk because they could essentially use the same gear. So suddenly we started getting pretty significant landings. The commission didn't come up with a plan because there was one state that was opposed to it. I won't say the name of the state, but it rhymes with Massachusetts. So they left it up to each one of the states, and all the states put in a size limit except for Connecticut and New York. It took us the better part of 6 years, and what was going on was there's good data that size limit for maturity is like 5.5 inches, and we were getting harvest in Long Island Sound for 3-inch whelk, and we were watching the population collapse. But because of political input, whatever, we had a long time and a long duration, we finally got the size limits in. So I believe those size limits are in, but we kind of believe there was significant damage done, at least in that local area, because of that overharvest. We were also seeing boatloads of them going down south from some of our ports. So there was a great deal of harvest going on, which gave us concern. We don't have a lot of information on the population or what happened to it. So The fact that conch and whelk is still a big fishery that replaced a lobster fishery, I would strongly suggest we keep our eye on that. I don't think there's action at this point, but we really should be paying attention to that because that is, from what we can see, a significant and possibly expanding fishery. Thanks.
Mike Luisi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim kind of stole my thunder on this one. I saw the whelk and the conch information pop up, and I won't go back through it again. But Jim is correct. We, the Mid-Atlantic states, especially in the Delmarva area, we have regulations, size limit regulations. We've been struggling for years because I think the science is clear that the age at maturity change, or the size of maturity changes as you move north. And our current regulations do not match the science. So even though we have some rules in place, we're still taking out a lot of animals before they become sexually mature. And it's a concern, which leads me to my question. You know, given this report and you know, Julia, you asked for council feedback. So what is practical feedback? Is there something that can come of this discussion that applies the council and the management process to it? Or is this just simply kind of keeping an eye on things and making sure that we don't see some major spikes? And if we do see the major spikes, then what do we do? If whelk landings go up tenfold and now we're at, you know, it making up 50% of the unmanaged harvest, do we have any ability to do anything about that, or do we go back to the states and re-debate at ASMFC how we do things? I'm just looking for a practical application of the council's process to the report and the information in the report. It's very general and broad, but maybe you can help me understand that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's up to you all. In prior versions of this presentation, I had a description of what happened with chub mackerel, where there was an increase in unmanaged landings of chub mackerel that ultimately led to that species being managed as a stock in an FMP. But there's other things that the council could consider. So I think it's just kind of up to the council in terms of, you know, what you're concerned about and what the appropriate path forward is. And I do think part of the intent of this report was to think about, like, do any of these species need management? And if so, what is the appropriate path forward? But I think I would kind of put it back on you all. While I have the mic, I did double check the whelk filters, and I think that I might need to correct what I said, that there are some individual whelk species that are filtered out in several states. It might just be like the overall grouping. So I might need to fix that. It might be a typo in what I had in it is more than just New Jersey that was filtered out. So I will, you know, correct anything in the report that needs correcting. So just want to clarify that.
Chris Pat Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Julia, for the presentation. Yeah, just on the subject of whelks and conchs, North Carolina doesn't have any regulations because we lack the rulemaking authority, you know, to put regulations in. So some of those landings are probably coming from us. I guess maybe not of interest or concern to the Mid-Atlantic Council, but probably of interest to the South Atlantic Council. And Julia, I flagged this earlier to you, was the red porgy landings in the Mid-Atlantic Council area, Mid-Atlantic region, which I think recent year was around what, 40,000, over 40,000 pounds. Excuse me. And the commercial ACL for the entire South Atlantic Council region is like 31,500 and change. I think that stock's been under numerous rebuilding plans. So I don't know if that's something that it might need to be explored a little more to kind of, I know it's confidential landings, but figure out, you know, what's going on with that fishery. Are they indeed red porgy? And to also make sure that South Atlantic Council staff's aware of this increasing trend of the species that they manage up in Mid-Atlantic waters. Thanks.
Mike Penny.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, Chris raised an issue that I was curious about, which is understanding species that are managed under South Atlantic Council FMP that might be moving into Mid Atlantic Council waters, and seeing increasing landings in Mid Atlantic states. I mean, this is what led to blue line tilefish, a number of years ago. And it's unclear to me to the extent to which that's being tracked right now. I mean, Chris mentioned red porgies, but if you hear reports about Spanish mackerel showing up a lot, and that's not tracked. And so I'm just curious the extent to which we're already sort of looking at South Atlantic Council managed species, and whether there's a way, if there are some that are not being tracked, that we might want to incorporate into this report, just to kind of flag what might be happening in the Mid Atlantic states.
Julia.
So we do take all council managed species and filter them out throughout their management unit. So it depends on the species for the South Atlantic. So the red porgy landings here are only those north of North Carolina, because North Carolina and South are managed by the South Atlantic Council. But we don't have any sort of special flag for species like that. So that's why it's useful, to have you all weigh in on it, and because I wouldn't have known about that ACL issue for red porgy if Chris Pat Savage hadn't brought it up. But if we think there's some sort of, I guess this is kind of like what we struggle with in terms of we don't have like a specific metric that we can just calculate like, hey, this is jumping out as a concern for this reason. But if we think there's some sort of like flag that we could put on species that meet that definition, then we could think about that.
Carrie.
Yeah, I'm here to make an unauthorized offer. We'll give you a lot of red snapper if we can have some of our black sea bass and red porgy back. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, but no thanks. Chris Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Mike Pentney's point, so if we saw landings of triggerfish increase north of North Carolina, how would that appear in your tables?
Yeah, so we have this table that shows increasing landings each year, and then this table showing increasing or stable rank order. So it would show up in one of these tables. So I think, and also the species that get into these tables, they change a lot year to year, because it's kind of rare for a species to have like, and maybe this is a problem doing it just like the absolute value of landings. Like it's pretty rare to have like every single year over more than like 3 years in a row, your absolute value of landings increase. Maybe we need to get a little fancier about how we define like a longer term trend in increasing landings. But so far we've just done these sorts of tables where like are your land, because even if you look at increasing landings, but if it comes down just a little bit in 1 year, then it doesn't make it onto this table, but it could still be a longer term increasing trend. But we don't have a specific method for looking at something like that yet, but that would probably be worth considering to help flag some of those things. Again, like nothing like really jumped out at just looking at the data in the report this year, but I think that is something that's come up in the past that the council's concerned about, kind of more incremental increases over time that might not jump out as like a massive increase all of a sudden, but could be more of a slower trend that would still be of concern. So maybe we do need to think harder about how we identify those trends.
Yeah, thanks for that, Julia. So I think we do, right? Given some of the comments that we heard this morning and some of the other concerns, some of the things that you and I have talked about. So certainly I think we should think about that for next year. The other thing, like seeing the number of folks that are interested in this particular topic and the number of comments that we've gotten this morning, next year, this will be on the agenda for an hour instead of a half an hour. So I appreciate your thoroughness and certainly excellent presentation. One quick point. You mentioned a couple times a 1,700 pound trip limit. So you went through it very quickly. right? So you have this bundle of species that are unmanaged, right? That we have this combined 1,700 pound trip limit for. Just explain that very quickly, how we arrived at 1,700, because there's folks around the table and probably out in virtual land that have never really even thought about that or heard about it. So if you could talk about that quickly, I think that'd be helpful. And you did reference it, by the way, in that that neon squid EFB. Thanks.
Yeah, so off the top of my head, it was from the forage amendment. We had we looked at landings of all the species that were part of the forage amendment, and I forget the specific metric that we used, but it was meant to cover, it was meant to basically kind of like cap, prevent increases in unmanaged commercial landings of those species. So it was some metric of like 90% of the trips that of those species had that amount or lower. Might have to look back at the document for the exact amount, but it was intentionally meant to kind of cap things at recent levels and not place restrictions on, just prevent things from growing. But it was based on analysis of what had been landed at the trip level up to that time of those species.
Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Chris Bassavage and I were thinking along the same lines, just the number of species from the Stamford Grouper complex that I was seeing just in the, in table 4 and table 5. A couple quick things, probably like a decade ago, South Atlantic Council staff had put together, just an information document that showed landings from, the coastal migratory pelagics, which is king and Spanish mackerel, as well as, snapper grouper species, and how those had been increasing in mid-Atlantic and New England states. I mean, for coastal migratory pelagics, that management unit obviously runs through New York. The South Atlantic Council's been doing these mackerel port meetings up and down the coast. I know Carrie can probably talk about next steps for that. So there are some ancient documents, I guess, that we could, bring to bear on that as well. And red porgy's been overfished and overfishing for at least like the past decade. Recruitment is flatlined, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a concern. The one thing I was going to also mention was with Almaco Jack, it noted that nearly all the unmanaged landings were from South Carolina and state permits. And I know that South Carolina automatically complements the regulations from the Snapper Grouper complex in state waters. So just that for you, Julia, I don't know, Carrie, if there's some exception for Almaco.
Sorry, y'all's mics are different than ours. That is true up until last week when the state of South Carolina passed a law that there are not complementary regulations, almost no regulations for snapper grouper species in state waters. Even though we know they're not caught in state waters, it is going to muddy the water. So the caveat would be anything going forward I wouldn't use.
Thanks for that. Hot off the presses.
I'll send you.
Joe Grist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Joe, good presentation, great information. I wanted to go back. I know we're doing a lot of snapper grouper here, but I want to go back to a comment you made on the sea robins that I thought I heard you make. I just want to clarify. You showed the survey data, and I thought I heard you make a comment that what we're seeing in trends with sea robin are paralleling up with what we're seeing with summer flounder. Is that because I don't see it in the presentation documents or in the briefing package, but I thought I heard you make that comment. I'm curious about that and the data, where the data comparison might be to look at.
Yeah, that was a comment that an advisor made, and I didn't pull in information on summer flounder, but so I don't, and off the top of my head, I don't know like the trends in summer flounder and how that compares to this, but summer flounder has had low recruitment in recent years, and I know the biomass is below the target level, but it's not overfished. And we're getting an assessment update on summer flounder this year. So that was just a comment that an advisor made, not something that we've like done an analysis or have like a direct comparison for. I think he was just kind of saying like generally summer flounder are, not in great shape right now, that they're below the target level. They're less available than they used to be. And sea robins are also, he's seeing less availability of those. So he was wondering if they are correlated. So that's just an advisor comment, not like something that we have supported by analysis.
No, I appreciate that. I would be curious though, sometime down the road, I know there's an abundant amount of time in y'all's schedule, but maybe just to take a look at the trends and just see if there's some validity to the comment in the data. It would be curious to know that. Thank you. Good job.
Peter Hughes.
Hey, good morning, everybody. My apologies for not being there in person. Had something I had to do. But going back to conch, and this is a great discussion. This is a great presentation. It is getting a lot of traction, and it's going to need an hour on the agenda next year. But going back to conch, and depending upon how granular we want to get, I'm not sure what the state reporting requirements are, but I can tell you as dealers, we don't buy conchs altogether and call them conchs. There are two, particular species in New Jersey that are landed. There's the smooth conch and there's a knobby conch. There's also, if you go further south, there's also a lightning conch or a left-hand conch. I forget what they call it. But the two species in New Jersey from a dealer's perspective, they're priced completely differently. So they're landed separately. They might be on the same trip, but they're categorized and landed separately because we paid two different prices for the two different distinct species of conch that are landed in New Jersey. So I'm not sure how granular you want to get on this report, but that's out there. But that would be based on what the reporting requirements are from the states, I guess. So thanks. That's my comments.
Richard Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to thank Julie and staff for this report. I look forward to it every year. And it allows for this discussion about unmanaged species. And some of these species are quite substantial fisheries for states. For example, conchs are third biggest fishery in Delaware. And these species have very vulnerable biologies to overfishing. They grow slowly. They have low fecundity. And so I mean, it's an important, I'm glad we're going to have an hour next year for this. For the conchs issue, I think Julia did filter out these, the landings by states. I know Jim and Mike brought up that we all have size limits on it, but I think I think those 1.5 million pounds is probably waved whelk, which don't have any regulations on it. And that's an offshore species. So I think you did properly filter them out, but I'm glad to see them there because we don't get this attention. Those species don't get this kind of attention at our level. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Greg Hewitt.
Yeah, just to add to what Mike said earlier about Petney, that I do, fishing every day and everything, do see a lot of southern species migrating up more. We see more to sheep's head, and we're even able to target the triggerfish, later on in the summer and things of that nature. And we see a lot of the Spanish mackerel, although they're kind of tough to catch. We do see a fair amount of them and everything else as well. Just a comment about the sea robin thing. The last couple of years, I've actually seen more of them in my daily, fishing trips and everything else, smaller sizes and larger sizes, which I think is an encouraging thing. But I mean, just in my area, obviously. But to what Mike said earlier, there's definitely a lot of southern species moving up our way that I did not see 10 years ago where we could actually target as well. So. Thanks, and this conversation is excellent. So thank you very much.
Bobby Rule.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very good presentation. A lot of information there. The two questions I had are just really simple questions. One of them is a clarifying question on the, it's basically to refresh my memory on the trip limit. I know we came up with a 1,700-pound trip limit, but was there a time associated with that? Was it a trip defined as a 24-hour period or as a singular effort? That's question one. And the second question is going back to the slides where there's been an increase in landings. Is there a way to correlate that if the increase in landings is driven by an increase of participation or by mean weight per trip?
So far for these reports, we've just been looking at like total annual landings, Maine through North Carolina, for whatever counts as unmanaged. We haven't been breaking it down into what's driving that, like you suggested. So that could be interesting to think about. And I think that would be worth looking into if there is anything of concern to the council, like what is driving it? Like, are more people participating? Are, people catching more per trip, things like that? But short answer is no, we haven't looked into anything at that level yet. And then I might have to look back at the specific language for that 1,700-pound possession limit, but I think it was just 1,700-pound possession at any point in time. I don't think it was defined over. Off the top of my head, I don't recall any discussions about that, but maybe Garfo can help me out.
Mike Bentley.
Yep. Yeah, the reg just says 1,700 pounds per trip. So it doesn't limit the number of trips per day or a 24-hour period.
All right, with that, Julia, thank you very much. And sounds like you're going to have quite a discussion next year with this as well. Thank you. Let's go to our next agenda item, the 2025 Modular Ocean Model 6 presentation. Dr. Vincent Sabal will give us a presentation on the Modular Ocean Model, MOM 6. It's a 3-year dimensional ocean circulation model designed primarily for studying the ocean climate system. Dr. Zabal, are you on? Are you ready?
I'm here. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound fine.
Okay. I just need to share my screen here. Just give me 1 second. I did also share my talk on Google Drive if anyone was able to download that. Okay. It doesn't look like I'm able to share my screen.
There we go. We have it now.
There we go. Perfect. There's just a couple animations here, folks. So whoever's running the show here, I'll just let you know when you can click the play button on those animations. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks, folks. Good morning. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate giving me the time here to discuss our latest ocean forecast for the region. These are brand new, hot off the presses, so looking forward to giving you all an update. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to give you a little background, this is a figure from a paper we published a few years ago in PLOS Climate. And, one interesting thing about our region, the U.S. Northeast Shelf, which includes the Gulf of Maine and the Mid-Atlantic, relative to other regions, not only around the country, but also around the world, is the unique warming trends that we've seen, mostly in the last decade or so. In the last 13 to 14 years, we've not only seen a pretty dramatic increase in surface temperature, but also a dramatic increase in bottom temperature. So the left panel here is showing you the sea surface temperature trend. This is the average temperature trend from 2010 to 2019. And this is relative to the 1993 to 2019 historical climatology, just to give you a reference point. The right panel is showing that same relative trend, but for bottom temperature. And really, when you look at the bottom temperature trend in ocean temperature, that's what really stands out relative to other parts of North America and throughout Central America. And if you were to zoom out and look at the global ocean, you would also see the U.S. Northeast Shelf in that red hotspot lighting up for bottom temperature. And so, we have some sense of why we're seeing this change over the last 10 years. And we believe it's a combination of global warming, but also this natural decadal variability in the position of the Gulf Stream, which I'll get into in a few more slides. Next slide, please. So what did the conditions look like last year? So last year, which we just published in our latest 2025 SOE, I'm sure some of you were able to get a hold of that report. For the first time in over about 12 to 13 years, we saw some changes. One of the major changes that we saw throughout the Northeast Shelf, some areas more so than others, was somewhat of not only a pause in that warming, but also a cooling in some regions. This was the first year where we had only one surface marine heat wave reported for 2024. It was a very short-lived heat wave. I think it was around Georges Bank, but no other heat waves were reported in either the surface or the bottom. You can see that one of the highlights there from our 2025 SOE for February 2024, showing you the temperature difference. And we did have somewhat cooler conditions throughout 2024. If you look to the left panel there for the Gulf Stream Index, which measures the northern position of the Gulf Stream, you can see that the measurement on the far right, which is 2024, was among the lowest in the last 12 years or so in terms of the Gulf Stream being its furthest south over the last 15 years that we've been measuring it and reporting an increase in terms of a northern shift in the Gulf Stream. So it seems to be an association where the position of the Gulf Stream is linked to the temperature of the water that we're seeing in the system. One thing that we have also observed is a greater influence of Labrador slope water, which is colder, fresher, and it's also more acidic. So some of the ocean pH measurements, ocean acidity measurements, also indicate more acidic waters from that colder, fresher water. Next slide, please. So this is giving you a snapshot of bottom temperature for the Mid-Atlantic Bight. This is also from the 2025 SOE. And you can see for 2024, we did have a much cooler bottom temperature in the Mid-Atlantic. We haven't seen bottom temperature this cool since about the early 2000s. We do expect decadal interannual variability in the system. It was a pretty dramatic shift from 2023 into 2024. The red line is a ROMS ocean regional model. That's the bias, which goes back to the late 1950s. And then where the black line starts, that is the Glory's reanalysis product, which essentially is an interpolation model, which assimilates observations and then uses a model to fill in those gaps. So we typically use Glory's for high resolution bottom temperature throughout the region, and then we're able to compare that to our survey data and our observations. Next slide, please. This is another figure from the 2025 SOE. The red line is the proportion of Gulf Stream water entering the Northeast Channel in the Gulf of Maine. That's where the slope water from the two currents enter the Northeast Shelf. The two currents being the Gulf Stream, the warmer, saltier current, and the Labrador current, which is the colder, fresher current coming from the north, which is the blue line. And as you can see for 2024, which is on the far right here, the blue is at a much higher level than it has been since about 2011 or so. And essentially what we see is when we see an increase in Labrador slope water entering the Gulf of Maine, we see a decrease because basically you can imagine this kind of hot, cold water spigot being turned off and on. More Gulf Stream water, the hot water spigot's turned on. More Labrador water, the cold water spigot is turned on. And so for 2024, we had more of that colder, fresher water entering the Gulf of Maine at depth and then eventually circulating south into the Mid-Atlantic. Next slide, please. Okay, and this should be an animation. So if the person controlling this could just hit the play button there, this should run. If it doesn't, that's fine. I can just explain it. Oh, go back one slide. Okay, no worries if you can't run it. So essentially, when we want to forecast ocean conditions for our region, being the U.S. Northeast Shelf, because it is a relatively small, large marine ecosystem, which I know is a oxymoron, but it is relatively small compared to other coastal systems. It's also highly dynamic in terms of regional ocean model regional ocean circulation, and its complex bathymetry. So we need these very high resolution ocean models to be able to resolve ocean circulation with a certain level of skill that we're comfortable with, so that we can trust our ocean forecasts and long-term predictions. So if you look at the left panel, that's a 10-kilometer global high-resolution ocean model called CM 2.6, which is developed here at NOAA GFDL. And the right panel is a same model, just at a lower resolution at 100 kilometers. And you can see the Gulf Stream skill is much, much higher in the high-resolution model. It breaks off the U.S. East Coast about where it should, around Cape Hatteras, whereas in the ocean, the low resolution ocean model, it overshoots Hatteras and extends too far north. So we are now at the point where we're able to use these high resolution models to forecast and predict ocean conditions into the future. Next slide, please. So this can also have consequences for long-term projections. I'm sure some of you have seen this figure before, but this is showing you long-term ocean model projections over the next 80 years for bottom temperature. The low resolution models are in the top left, top right, and bottom left, and the high resolution model, or the highest resolution model, is in the bottom right. And essentially, in a nutshell, what you're seeing here is that the high resolution model projects non-uniform warming in bottom temperature over the next 80 years throughout the US eastern seaboard, whereas the low resolution models predict uniform warming. And this is exactly what we're seeing today, where we're seeing certain parts of the US Northeast Shelf warming faster than other regions. Next slide, please. So this is where NOAA's CEFI comes into play. NOAA's CEFI was originally called the Climate Ecosystems Fisheries Initiative. It is now termed the Changing Ecosystems and Fisheries Initiative. I apologize for not updating this slide. This was something that was changed about 3 to 4 weeks ago. So we're still making our updates to our slides and websites. But essentially, the main goal of NOAA's CEFI is a cross-NOAA line office effort between NOAA Fisheries, NOAA Research, OAR, and the National Ocean Service to basically come together and develop these high-resolution regional ocean modeling products, historical simulations, forecasts, predictions, and long-term projections, put them into an information hub, which we call the CEFI data portal, which I'll show in just a bit, and then inform our stakeholders through regional decision support teams. And so we've just started this process this year and are starting to make some headway. Next slide, please. So right now you can go to the, sorry, let's go back one more. If you just get back to that slide on the portal, that'd be great. You have to go back one. Try to go up one more again. Okay, I'll start with this one. So for the US East Coast, we were fortunate to get the modeling products first. So for 2024, we had a historical model simulation, which went from 1993 to 2019. We were also able to test retrospective seasonal predictions in that year. And then for 2025, we have an updated hindcast, which now goes up through 2023, which hasn't been published yet, which should be going in the CFI portal soon. We have decadal predictions going out to the 2030s, which I'm going to show today. And we also have our first seasonal forecast, which go through the end of 2025, which I'm also going to show today. The West Coast and the Arctic will be the second groups to get their modeling products. And then the Great Lakes and Pacific Islands will be the third delivery of these high resolution ocean forecasts. Next slide, please. Okay. If you can hit the right arrow one more time to get the next animation up. Okay, perfect. So you can go to the NOAA's CEFI data portal today and actually visualize and download these ocean forecasts for our region. This just gives you a snapshot of what that would look like. This is for sea surface temperature. I believe this is the hindcast. You're able to download histograms, box plots, all sorts of things. You can visualize the data before downloading. And this is constantly being updated. So as the forecasts and predictions are being developed, vetted and validated, they're then placed on the portal. And I put the portal web address there, and it should be in the slide notes as well in your packets. Next slide, please. So there's two papers that I'll be discussing today. The top one here is by Ross et al., who's at GFDL, Charlie Stock and others in 2024, which are these new dynamically downscaled seasonal ocean forecasts for our region. And the second paper, which was also published last year, is what we're calling a decadal prediction. So this is a bit different than the seasonal predictions where you're trying to actually predict, say, July of 2025's ocean bottom temperature for Georges Bank or the Mid-Atlantic Bight, versus a decadal prediction where you're just trying to predict the mean state of the climate over the next 10 years. So for example, you're not trying to say ocean bottom temperature in the Mid-Atlantic Bight in July of 2030 is going to be X. You're basically just trying to say we're expecting cooler than average conditions or warmer than average conditions over the next 5 years in the summer. That is what these decadal predictions are meant for. They're not meant to give you an exact month within a specific year, whereas the above paper is trying to do that over the next 12 months. Next slide, please. So if you can hopefully run this animation, there should be, if you key over your, there we go, perfect. So this is the forecast for 2025 for ocean bottom temperature. And you can keep running this over and over again while I'm talking if you want. The animation on the left is showing you the average bottom temperature over the last 10 years relative to the 1994 to 2023 mean. The right panel is that same climatology comparison to the anomaly, however, for the year 2025. So this is a forecast that was initialized in April of 2025, April 1st, and then it is run using a high-resolution MAFMC regional model nested inside a global coarser model called SPEAR. So the SPEAR model is a global coarse model forcing a high-res model, which is MAFMC, for our waters in our neck of the woods here. And what's interesting about this is that if you look at the prediction for 2025 throughout the year, you can run the animation one more time. You can still see these cooler than average conditions predicted to persist. However, if you look at the Mid-Atlantic Bight, you can see this is not uniform, especially once you get into the summer and fall. You can see the southern Mid-Atlantic Bight where the Gulf Stream breaks off the Hatteras, much warmer than the last 10 years. However, you look at the northern Mid-Atlantic Bight and southern flank of Georges Bank and the shelf break, we're predicting cooler than average conditions in bottom temperature. And what's really striking here is that the Gulf of Maine is predicted to be much cooler than average over the course of the summer and into the fall, with the coastal waters being somewhat warmer than what we're predicting for the deeper parts of the Gulf of Maine and the basins. Next slide, please. So if we now zoom out and do that same animation for 2025, I really like this figure here. So this is just showing you shelf waters. The model domain does extend into deeper waters, but we're interested in the shelf waters. You can see a lot of that blue in the U.S. Northeast Shelf, particularly around Georges Bank, the Gulf of Maine, and the Scotian Shelf. But where we're seeing warmer than average predictions for 2025 is just north of Cape Hatteras and the southern Mid-Atlantic Bight and parts of southern New Jersey throughout the summer and into next fall. Now, this forecast is going to be reinitialized by Andrew Ross July 1st. So we'll have a new forecast to see once we reinitialize if these cooler than average conditions in these waters and warmer than average in southern Mid-Atlantic Bight are going to persist and be consistent with the next model initialization. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I want to show you what a decadal forecast looks like for our region. So this animation is showing you the average sea surface temperature. So before I was showing you bottom temperature, the skill for the decadal prediction is much higher for the surface. They're working on a new version for bottom temperature. So we're just going to show you sea surface temperature decadal predictions for today until the simulation comes out. And what you can see on the left panel here are the average SST anomalies for the past 10 years, 2013 to 2022. And then on the right panel, this is up through 2022 through 2031. And you can see in the surface, there's still warmer than average conditions predicted over the next 10 years into the early 2030s, but not as warm as we've seen in the last 10 years. And so there's this paper that Vilmel published last year that is basically suggesting there's going to be this pause in the warming that we've seen. Not so much of a cooling, but more of a pause in the warming in the surface waters. The analysis is not highly confident at this point in the bottom water, but the new simulation has higher skill for bottom temperature. And I'll be sure to update the council on the new predictions that are revised for the next 10 years when those simulations are ready. Next slide, please. And so if you take a time series of that decadal prediction on the left, this is the Mid-Atlantic Bight, and on the right is the Gulf of Maine. The blue line is the decadal prediction using the coarse spear model that I mentioned before, and the red line is the high-resolution MAFMC prediction. And then all the little squiggly lines you're seeing there are individual ensemble members that have different initialization dates. So it's the same model, just a different initialization date to run that decadal prediction. And what you can see is that if you run the spear model by itself without the high-resolution model nested, you do get a bit of a cooling into the 2030s. But we know that's probably not realistic because we know that the spear course model doesn't do a good job at resolving the regional circulation of the Northeast Shelf. If you look at the red line into the 2030s, that's where you see that pause in surface temperature throughout the Mid-Atlantic Bight and also throughout the Gulf of Maine. And so it'll be really interesting once we get the new version of this decadal prediction that resolves bottom temperature better to see if we also see a pause in that warming and possibly even maybe some cooling like we've seen in 2024 and into 2025. Next slide, please. This is my last slide here. So if one were to ask, well, how are we working with our fisheries partners, cooperative research, and how are we validating these forecasts in real time? So Andrew Ross provided this to me about a week ago, and showing our EMOLT observations from our cooperative research program with the lobster fishery from May of 2025, compared to Glory's bottom temperature, and then compared to the forecast for May 2025, initialized April 1st. And so this gives you a sense of how we can validate this forecast in real time. Now, the Glory's reanalysis in the middle is probably still our best product to compare because it's high resolution. It's using observations, but it's also interpolating where there's gaps in those observations, because obviously in bottom temperature, we don't have observations at a high resolution. So we rely on our EMOLT program, our trawl survey, and various other surveys, XBT, so on and so forth, that are measuring bottom temperature. And I'll stop here and take questions if we have some time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's going to be interesting to see how things play out. Richard Wong.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saba, for that presentation. It's fascinating. Quick question: what is the cause, or what are the hypotheses that are causing this pause in the rapid temperature rise?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So the current hypothesis now is that there's this natural decadal variability that's acting in synchrony with climate change, with global warming. So we know from historical observations that there's this kind of interplay between the Labrador Current and the Gulf Stream on a multi-decadal scale, right? So we've seen these kind of cold phases or cold pulses throughout the 1970s, early 2000s, and now we're seeing it again in 2024 and in 2025. There was a nice paper published by my colleagues at URI, Jamie Palter's group, looking at this kind of interplay around the tail end of the Grand Banks. And what essentially they identified there was when the Gulf Stream was shifted further north, there's this blocking mechanism that occurs where the Gulf Stream actually blocks a large portion of that Labrador colder, fresher water that makes its way around the southern flank of the Grand Banks. And so now that we're seeing a more southern Gulf Stream, more of that Labrador fresher, colder water is now able to penetrate through the tail end of the Grand Banks and work its way south into the Gulf of Maine and then eventually into the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And so we think that we may be entering one of those phases again, where maybe over the next 10 years, the Gulf Stream may be a little bit further south, but we're still seeing this overall warming trend. It's just not as great as what we've seen over the last 10 years. So I hope that answers your question.
Jim Gilmore.
Thanks, Chairman. And thanks for the presentation. It kind of raised a whole lot of questions. So I guess the current models that with this cooling thing that we've all heard about, seems to be interesting. And I'm sure there's places like Maine and the Gulf of Maine, if it's going to get cooler, all those lobsters going to Canada are going to turn around and come back, which I think would make them very happy. But I guess the issue with modeling is like, so now we're seeing cooling, and I go back a few years back, there's a paper by Janet Nye et al. That was saying the data they were looking at initially was looking at mean surface temperature, and it didn't seem like anything was changing. And then all of a sudden they looked at the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, and it turns out, yes, now there was quite a difference in terms of what were the predictions that the ocean was getting warmer. So that was hooked together with fisheries and where they were going. So as much as this is extremely interesting and be really big impacts on how we manage fisheries, I think, is it an anomaly that this is happening, or is this something that, would be helpful? Because the council and most of the management bodies wouldn't really react until we start seeing the stocks changing their distribution because of this. So anyway, I'm just, and again, is the AMO was the big change back for a few years ago. So is that data included in this, or is that even the consideration under what you guys are doing? Thanks a lot.
Yeah, great point, great question. So the AMO is essentially, when you calculate that index, you're basically averaging temperature across the North Atlantic basin. So the AMO should be picking up these changes. And we do believe this is AMO, NAO, you've heard all these different large scale climate teleconnections. We believe it's all AMO, NAO, and possibly AMOC, overturning circulation connected, right? So, we've always experienced these decadal oscillations throughout our region. And we're fortunate to be able to go way back, even into the 1950s, 1940s, and actually pick up some of these warm, cold phases that are just occurring naturally from this interplay between the Gulf Stream and Labrador, so on and so forth. And, to your point about the Nye paper as well, which I know looked at surface temperature, one interesting thing that we're finding is that the trends that we see with surface temperature are not always matching up what we're seeing in bottom temperature. I'm working on a paper right now for heat waves, and the surface heat waves are not always in sync when we see bottom heat waves. And this is especially the case in the summer when the water is not well mixed and we have the water much more stratified. And so we're going to continue to focus on the surface and bottom separately, so that when reporting to the councils and our stakeholders, we're able to identify differences between what we're seeing in the surface and what we're seeing in the bottom. The problem is that we just don't have a lot of bottom measurements in real time to validate these models as fast as we'd like to. So that's why I'm showing here, we have the EMOLD program, which has been great. But the more bottom temperature data we can get from our cooperative research programs and surveys, the better, so that we can keep validating these models and predictions. But I don't think it's an anomaly right now. I do believe this may persist based on what we're seeing in the observations today throughout 2025. The question I have is, will this persist over the next 3 years? Because that is what the decadal predictions are suggesting, that this pause and in some areas of cooling could occur up until the early 2030s. But I agree with you. Take caution for now until we can actually get more observations to validate these forecasts.
Michelle Duvall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Dr. Seva, for the presentation. I guess when I'm thinking about the scary 2025, forecast that you've shown us, and how, and maybe this is actually a question for Dr. Hare, like how are these types of short-term predictive tools being incorporated into, I'm thinking about projections coming out of stock assessments, for some of our species for which we have, clear temperature dependent characteristics. I mean, this is such a great tool, how are we propagating this throughout other parts of the scientific and management process? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So that is the role of the CEFI Northeast Decision Support Team. That is which I'm the chair of. So that is our job, is to get this information into the management process, and that's whether it's qualitative or quantitative, where quantitative meaning it's a variable in the stock assessment. So we've made some headway with black sea bass with bottom temperature in the winter. That assessment is not yet using the forecasts, but they have looked at the hindcast and the decadal predictions. We've also done that for Southern New England, Mid-Atlantic yellowtail flounder with the New England Council. And so we're just starting now to scratch the surface. I know we're making some headway with scallops and lobster, winter flounder and summer flounder as well. Are we at the point now where we're using these 12-month forecasts for the assessment? No, but we have started to look at the decadal outlooks, because it seems like these decadal 10-year outlooks might be more relevant than these near-term 6-9 month outlooks, just based on timing and how the management process works. But if anyone feels that there is room for these near-term forecasts potentially influence management, we would love to work with anyone who feels that they could be useful in terms of, assessing uncertainty and skill, because right now they do seem to be relatively skillful.
Thanks for that. I'll have to ruminate on that a bit and think about, how we could take those, these short-term annual predictive tools and think more about, how we can use that to improve our management, or at least, I think give, fishermen a sense of what might be expected. And maybe that's what I'm thinking more about, is how do we get this information out to the fishing public? Thanks so much.
No problem.
Bobby Rule.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not trying to open a can of worms or anything here, but and it may be well beyond the scope of what this model is for, but do you have the ability to predict what or forecast what the impacts would be of the subcooling stations? If you a certain percentage of them, 50% or 100% or whatever, what the actual cumulative impacts would be of using the cooling stations for wind would have on sea surface temperature over time?
Did you say the cooling stations?
Yeah, the liquid cooling stations, where I don't know the metrics as far as what the actual volumes are and temperatures are, but it's pretty significant. And I didn't know if there was a way to kind of halfway predict what the possible impacts would be to surface temperature over time.
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with, I guess I'm not understanding your question about cooling stations. Are you talking, is this related to offshore wind?
Yes, most definitely.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with cooling stations, so I really, I'm going to have a hard time answering that question. But I mean, there's been some folks looking at trying to model the impacts of offshore wind on local circulation. I haven't seen any of those results yet. But at this point now, none of the models that are being the current MAFMC model doesn't include any impacts of offshore wind in the ocean circulation. So that is something that we are trying to do now, use the MAFMC model and actually try to incorporate offshore wind into the model, see how ocean circulation will be impacted. I believe some folks in Europe and Germany have started to do that for the Mediterranean. And they have some interesting results. I haven't read those papers yet. I think they're currently in prep, but that is something we would like to do in this region. We just haven't done it yet.
James Fletcher.
Is there any chance that NOAA will look at starting with the sunspot cycles and go back 200 years and plot those, and then come in and look at North Atlantic oscillation and the tide cycles and run a program to show how, with those cycles plotted out, the species of fish have increased and decreased? In a lifetime of a fisherman, they see usually 2 or 3 booms and busts of the species. In Japan and some of the other countries, they have started to do aquaculture projects based on what these solar cycles, tide cycles, lunar cycles, theirs is not North Atlantic oscillation, but it is an oscillation. Why are we so short-sighted in this year and next year, 2 years back? Why don't we look at the landings from where the Portuguese came over here fishing cod and go in and get an honest cyclical pattern where we can predict what the fisheries will be and how to harvest? At our current time, we now run behind and fail to harvest 25 to 50% of the species abundance. Is there any chance that NOAA would run the solar cycles, the tide cycles, and the lunar cycles over a 200 or 300 year period of time and then put in the landings of the fisheries? Is there any chance that we'll look at a broader scheme than what you presented today? Thank you. James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association.
Thanks, James. So just to let you know, the solar cycle, lunar cycle, tidal cycles are all built into these models. This particular model that I showed you today only goes back to 1993. So this model has not gone back, say, 200-300 years. However, there's been other NOAA efforts within GFDL where I sit, where they have gone back 200-300 years for their Earth system modeling exercises, which covers the global ocean. And they have found no influence of the solar cycle on these regional circulation decadal oscillations that I'm showing you today. And I can assure you that that's been vetted and peer reviewed over multiple different papers and different labs. So that is all built in. What hasn't been done is going back, say, hundreds of years with landings because we don't have the data, but we have looked at some of these decadal oscillations within the U.S. Northeast and how landings have been affected, and some of our trawl survey indices have been affected for these warm and cold pulses. And so the more observations we get, we're able to ascertain what some of those mechanisms might be. But yeah, we have the solar cycle, lunar cycle, tidal cycle. These are all built into the models already. Thank you.
Seeing no more hands, Vincent, thank you very much. It's a very interesting presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
With that, let's take a quick break. We'll give it 10 minutes. We'll come back at 10:35. 1 minute warning. All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's get started with our next agenda item this morning. It's the white paper on separate OFLs and ABCs for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. Back in December, the council tasked the SSC with development of a white paper on the scientific considerations for developing separate OFLs and ABCs for the commercial and recreational summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. And Julia Beatty and Dr. Paul Rago, who's remote, will be giving the presentation. Julia, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to kick things off, and then Dr. Rago will cover the bulk of the details of what has been considered so far. So I will just briefly review some progress and some background, and just to orient you all, the main objective for this discussion is for the council to provide guidance to the SSC subgroup on next steps. This subgroup feels that they've done a lot of work so far and they've laid out a lot of considerations, and they want more guidance from the council before they move forward with it. And it's possible that what they've done so far could be sufficient for the basis for the white paper. So if the council agrees with that, they could take what they've done so far and turn that into the white paper. But if there's anything beyond that that the council wants to see, it would be really useful to communicate that today so the subgroup knows where to go from here. And yeah, as the chair said, this is all related to something that the council tasked the SFC with as part of the 2025 implementation plan, which is development of a white paper on the scientific considerations of developing separate OFLs and ABCs for the commercial and recreational sectors for the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass fisheries. So kind of some background on why the council tasked the SFC with developing this white paper. It kind of stems from some changes to the process that were implemented through the percent change approach, which is the process for setting recreational bag size and season limits for these species. This was first implemented for the 2023 through 2025 specifications. And as you will recall from the last council meeting, the council approved modifications which will be effective for 2026 through 2029, and then additional modifications that will come into effect in 2030 is the goal, which is just all to say that this approach has been in place since 2023 and modified versions of it are expected to be used for the foreseeable future for the recreational fishery. So the issues that are related to this approach and how it relates to the white paper are expected to continue to be in play for the foreseeable future. And the key issue about how this all relates to the white paper is related to some concerns that were raised about how the percent change approach allows the recreational fishery to exceed their recreational harvest limit, or RHL, in some circumstances. The reason the percent change approach allows that is because the goal is to bring harvest close to the RHL over time, as opposed to what we used to do in the past, where we could set ourselves up for taking big changes and measures each year to try and pinpoint the RHL every single year. And that led to some big changes and measures. Measures could vary frequently and it caused lots of challenges. So the percent change approach aims to address that by making more incremental changes, reducing the potential for these larger changes and measures, And the determination of if and how measures should change is related to biomass compared to the target level and the degree of uncertainty in our harvest predictions. So it's not like there's an across the board allowance for RHL overages. It's just in some circumstances, such as when biomass is very high, there are some specific circumstances in which RHL overages are allowed under the percent change approach, which has, led to some conversations about how that impacts the commercial fishery. So as part of some reviews that the SSC did in 2022 and 2024 for management actions related to the percent change approach, in both of those reviews, the SSC noted that a management approach that shifts focus away from achieving the RHL could increase the frequency with which the overall ABC is exceeded. And then the SSC also said that they may change their assumption that the ABC will be caught in the projections to an assumption that the ABC will be exceeded, which would result in reduced catch advice or reduced ABCs for future years. So if you expect that the ABC is going to be exceeded, that kind of factors into the decision making for future ABCs. And then, of course, if you reduce the ABC, that impacts both the commercial and the recreational fisheries. The SSC also noted that the council's risk policy allows for very little buffer between the OFL and the ABC for stocks at high biomass levels. So for those higher biomass stocks, ABC overages carry a greater risk of also exceeding the OFL. And the SSC also pointed out as part of these reviews in the past that the council virtually never uses management uncertainty buffers for these species. So that also kind of increases the risk of these ABC and OFL overages. So the council received a letter from Seafreeze Limited in November 2024 that kind of touched on some of those points. And the letter said if the SSC recommends reduced ABCs due to recreational overages, this will harm the commercial sector. And the letter also stated that the current process for setting the recreational measures violates the commercial and recreational allocations because the commercial sector is still strictly held to their allocation. And to address all of this, the letter requested that the council initiate a framework action for establishing sector-specific OFLs and ABCs according to the commercial and recreational allocation percentages to kind of more separate the commercial, to more isolate this commercial sector from these sort of impacts to the ABCs that would be driven by the potential for overages in the recreational sector. So the council discussed this last December as part of the implementation planning for 2025. The council agreed that the SSC should first discuss the scientific considerations of having separate OFLs and ABCs for the commercial and recreational sectors. And then after that first step is done, then the council will consider the legal requirements because the legal considerations could be very different depending on the specific approach that is taken. There could be, potentially it could be very straightforward, or there could be major legal implications depending on the path that the council wants to go down. And at that time, the council also agreed that the outcome should not be constrained to the existing commercial and recreational allocation percentages at this point in time, that they wanted to have it more open-ended and consider different ways of doing it, and that this should take the form of a white paper. The council did not want to initiate a framework or other management action at this time, but first do this white paper and then go from there in terms of determining next steps. So the SSC formed a subgroup to work on this, and that subgroup has met twice. Their work was discussed by the full SSC twice, and there was also an update on this provided during the April council meeting as part of the SSC report. But we thought, because we're a little bit farther along and the subgroup really wants some more clear guidance from the council, that we wanted to spend a little bit more time kind of going into the details with you all today. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Rago, and he'll summarize some of the specifics of what the subgroup has talked about so far.
Thank you, Julia. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Great, thanks. Appreciate it. I want to thank Julia for a great introduction, and also my colleagues Yong Chen, Mike Wilberg, Tom Miller, and Mark Holliday, who serve on this subgroup there. Basically, my outline of where I'll be going today is basically say how it's done now, what we anticipate in terms of changes under a scientific paradigm, what the essential tasks would be, the consequences of that change, and then suggest a potential alternative. Next slide, please. So the first thing that's we want to kind of do is a schema of how it's done now. Beginning at the top, the OFL is determined by the stock assessment. It is considered by the SSC and addresses the not only the council's risk policy, but what is an appropriate level of variation, the coefficient of variation, or CV. That is used jointly to define the ABC. Now that red dash line is sort of the boundary layer between what is the scientific uncertainty and the management process. So following the determination of the ABC, the council's proportional allocation, generally embedded within an FMP or regulation, is used to define what the appropriate allocation of that ABC is, both to the commercial and recreational. These define the annual catch limits, which are then can be modified by the council to and reduced into the annual catch target. And then finally, taking into account additional factors such as dead discards, the commercial quota and the recreational harvest are the operational limits that are applied to the fishery. So during this process, of course, the proportion is the subject of generally long and extended debates and also reviews of historical information. So that's sort of the context. Now, if we were to go to a scientific process, and I'll explain this in more detail, but the next slide, please, shows what changes under a process in which the information is purely a scientific process at the start, and then transition to the council process. Now that obviously shifts the red line down because there are a couple extra tasks that are associated with that. So the first thing is that OFL is split into two components, and I call that PMOD in that top line there. So PMOD goes to one fishery, and 1 minus that fraction goes to the other. So that's essentially what we would do to split that OFL into the recreational and commercial components there. And I'll go into the details of a little bit on the what actually is used to generate that PMOD estimate there. Then once those OFLs are determined, we again apply the risk policy, but here it has to apply to both the commercial and the recreational fishery. So there would be an additional step, an additional layer of complexity associated with the split there. And from that, you would obtain the ABC for the commercial and the ABC for the recreational. So there, at that point, you are in fact determining those ABCs specifically for each component at that level. And then you cross that dashed line and go into the council process. Now, there are a couple points of friction here, and we'll get into this in some detail here, but one of the major ones is that PMOD may not be equal to the fraction that's been determined through the council process. So there's going to be a difference there, and that difference will be important to consider as we move forward. Then the process would go as before. The ACL would be transformed into the ACT, and then either the recreational harvest limit or the commercial quota. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this kind of setup is sort of begs the question about, how should the uncertainty be addressed there? I had my assistant, Mr. Flintstone, help me with this graphic so that we could kind of isolate those two parts there. The first is the ABC for the recreational, and then the second is, can you consider it within the management uncertainties? We'll, kind of maybe come full circle to this particular question. So next slide, please. So if we were to do a purely scientific basis for sector allocation, what's going to change? Well, the first is the allocation will be based on the assessment model rather than the council framework. The assessment models have within them the parameters that can be used to make that split, which makes it consistent internally with the model structure. The OFL CVs could differ by fishery, if there's sufficient information to justify that change. It has some consequences for the council's risk policy because now we have a mixture of risks associated with the fishery for the commercial and the fishery for the recreational. And then in order to accomplish this, there would need to be some additional simulation testing of the approach and then tasking to the Northeast Fishery Science Center. So the next slide, please. So the sector allocation, by splitting that OFL into recreational commercial quotas, it's basically related to the mathematics of the assessment model. That means that we would have the parameters that are derived from the model would be used to specify the contemporary split between the commercial and recreation, and it would be entirely consistent. What it would not be is equal necessarily to the proportions established under the council frameworks, and importantly, those allocations could change between assessments. So as the assessment model is updated through a management track assessment and so forth, it could result in a difference between what you had in the previous time step and the next planning interval. So next slide, please. There's also a need to change what we call the rubric or the methodology by which we set the OFL CV. Previously, we had 9 factors. They were reduced to 6 factors. We reported on that last year to the council and the changes. And the other change we made was we had 2 tiers. One, tier 1, which is data quality, the model structure, and the model performance. Those are the primary considerations. The secondary considerations are whether they're informed by external experiments, whether there's some additional validation, whether ecosystem information was incorporated, or in a related vein, whether there are trends in recruitment. So, those are the factors, that suite of factors that are used. And the tier 1 basically says that if you have crummy data, you can't overcome that limitation by using super sophisticated models. So that sort of puts that in context. And the next slide kind of shows what it might look like if we were to revise it. And by that revision, we're saying that we would have a separate CV associated with the commercial and the recreational fishery. And here, the emphasis would be on the difference in data quality. And by that, I mean, it would say that the uncertainty associated with the data quality in the recreational fishery versus the commercial would be sufficient to result in an overall change in the coefficient of variation associated with that fishery. So that's kind of what needs to happen or what needs to be evaluated in order to make that assignment. Next slide kind of gives you how this starts to fit into the council risk policy. And so the council risk policy, basically on the y-axis, you have the acceptable probability of overfishing. And on the x-axis, you have the relative stock size. So as the stock size decreases, your probability of overfishing should decline, and you want to be more cautious. And so, when you're above 1.5 times the BMSY, no worries. It doesn't have, you're not too concerned. But as you get to the BMSY target, that is 1, and as you drop down to about 10%, it gets to be more concerning, and you want to take more caution in terms of assigning a catch level. So this risk policy, as many of you know or recall, is based on extensive simulations, and they did a lot of work working interactively with the council based on the trade-offs and sort of the risks associated with various levels of overfishing. Now, this policy then is used to is combined with that OFL CV, and the next slide kind of shows what occurs with a single OFL CV assignment here, and that's so we have the combined. So on the y-axis we have that same value of the relative stock size biomass over BMSY. And then on the y-axis, in this case, is the ratio of the ABC to the OFL. So that is, how much do you have to reduce that ABC in order to satisfy the risk policy, and then how does that vary with how much variability that you find in it. So, for example, if you say that the appropriate CV is 150%, you'd get about 37% ABC relative to the OFL. If you were to say the CV is only 60% for that combined fishery, you would have a value of about 67%. So there's about a twofold difference in the realized ABC, depending on how variable it is. It doesn't make much difference when the stock is high, and certainly not too much when it's above ratio of 1. But it does become kind of a dramatic effect as the relative stock size declines. So what happens if you have separate ABCs and OFLs? Next slide, please. Kind of shows you what's going on here. Now you've split that risk, that relative ABC to OFL ratio, and you consider it first for the fishery 1 and for fishery 2. So if the fishery 2 has a higher CV, say 100% in this case, and the fishery 1 has a 60% CV, you would have a mixture of risks, a mixture of quotas to monitor. So that's again, and it just kind of shows that the stock size itself, of course, does not change, and so it's conditional on that mixture. So next, we say, okay, what? Next slide, please. What are the essential scientific tasks associated with this? First, we would want to do some comparisons of current allocations with the model-based allocation versus what's in the various amendments. We want to look at how much they vary over time with respect to various assessment updates to get some idea of what that particular scientific principle would entail. Next, we would have to revise that methodology for estimating or defining the coefficient of variation. It is a semi-quantitative process. It's not a fully scoring type metric there. So it will require a fair amount of discussion, and particularly the notion that the variation associated with the with a particular fishery in terms of the data quality is sufficient to result in an overall change in that risk factor for that fishery. then as the previous slide shows, you have this mixture of separate CVs for commercial and recreational. So what it entails for the overall risk policy would need to be examined. And then, of course, all of these things require meetings and staff time and support from the center and possibly new contracts to actually go through the simulation exercises that will be needed to test that. So next slide, please. Now, there are both foreseeable and unforeseeable consequences of this. So if we think of relying more on the stock assessment model for allocation, there are a lot of things that will change. First, the council and regional office responsibilities will increase to allow for varying allocations by year or by assessment cycle. The NFC and the FSC workload is going to increase because these changes will have to be implemented within the models themselves. It can be derived, but it would need to be programmed and have to be available on a kind of a generic basis. There's also, we're changing the risk policy. It's going to require, collaboration among the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, the SSC, and possibly contractor, resources. Previously, the management strategy evaluations were done entirely on sort of the scientific rather than the management uncertainty. The next slide, please. The unforeseeable effects include, possible revisions to existing regulations, delays in implementation of regulations for both these stocks and perhaps other stocks that are where the time budget is tied up. We don't really know how this will interact with the percent change approach in terms of its downstream effects. There could be interactions with other recreational fisheries such as bluefish. There again is a very high probability, but it's unforeseeable about there are differences that might arise between the council and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission in terms of regulations that are approved. And then finally, we have the elephant in the room with the potential changes in the MRIP effort estimates, which then will change the historic proportions, which then will change engender a need to change what the proportions are between sectors, and that would occur independently or could occur independently of that which occurs within the assessment model. So is there anything else that we could do? And one thing that came up during our discussions, next slide please, is simply to apply the management buffer between the annual catch target and the annual catch limit. So at that point, the uncertainty about the expected catch from a sector and its uncertainty can be addressed directly without changing existing regulatory framework or increasing the scientific workload or the system workload there. We want to make sure you don't do double counting. That is, you don't want to have a process in which you're assigning variability and addressing it on the basis of the CV, and then doubling down and reducing it further with the management uncertainty. So you want to be extremely careful there. And then finally, one point that the SSC did want to emphasize is that we recognize that varying sector allocations could be problematic. If we're simply looking at the changes induced by the assessment models, but it's also clear that those proportions should be responsive to changes that occur over time. Julia just outlined in her previous presentation, the many shifts that are occurring among species in the unregulated format. They're also occurring for the regulated species. So again, there are changes that will need to occur, and probably the biggest one, again, is the biggest one is going to be MRIP in the near term. So next slide, please. Just kind of does the schematic of that process here. Again, graphics designed by Mr. Flintstone, but essentially saying, okay, looking in those boxes there, are they a place where you could set the annual catch target less than the annual catch limit and address those additional issues there. So just my final slide will be just some comments from the SSC May meeting. We fully recognize that the most important responsibility we have is setting those ABCs, and we recognize that purely scientific basis for allocating catch and assigning uncertainties by sector can be developed, but this has implications for the entire management process, and it's going to require some additional work. We felt it was important to avoid mixing the science and policy as a kind of an overarching principle, and then finally, the scientific components, whether it's stock assessment, ecosystem, or social economic advice, can define what might be, but it cannot define what should be. So those were kind of where we are, perhaps a reasonable layout of where the discussion, where the scientific process can assist in this, and look forward to your guidance. And I'll turn it back to Julia for some final words. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, just 2 slides just to reorient the council to, what we're asking you to do with this information. Paul outlined a lot of questions and implications and additional work that could be done. That was all identified by the SSC and the subgroup. But the subgroup wasn't trying to say that all those questions need to be answered through the white paper, or that we need to do all that additional work through the white paper, but rather that the white paper would lay out, like, if you really want to go down this path, this is the additional analysis that you would need to do to make it ready to be implemented. And these are the things that you should consider. But, again, not to say that all that needs to be actually completed through the white paper. So again, unless directed otherwise today, we would have the SSC subgroup move forward with everything that was presented today as the basis for the white paper. So if you wanted to consider anything in addition to that, if you think anything needs further clarification, or if you think anything requires further development at this stage, it would be important to communicate that today. Otherwise, we'll move forward with what we have. And again, the goal was not to, complete every analysis that was suggested so far, but just to kind of lay out considerations of, if the council really wants to go down this path, here's some more work that would need to be done. So that's basically it. Turn it back over to you all. And again, the task is to provide direction to the SSC subgroup on next steps.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Paul. Comments or questions around the table? Michelle Duvall.
I hadn't even raised my hand yet, Mr. Chair.
You just started moving though, I could tell.
So, many thanks to Julia and Dr. Rago and the rest of the SSC subgroup that, had clearly a very thorough discussion of, this tasking. And I appreciate, I think, all of the key questions that are raised in the draft outline for the white paper. I mean, I think specific to, what's here on the screen, there's nothing additional that I would add. I think there's been an incredibly thorough consideration of, I think, what the council would need to consider down the road if this is a process that we want to undertake. And I think some of the key things that stick in my mind are, as we're going to be grappling with revisions to MRIP on a number of different fronts, as we walk down the road. So that's, one thing I think about, as well as the fact that, well, this can be done scientifically, it will have potential impacts on the allocations that we have currently established through the fishery management plans. And so I think that's something we all need to think long and hard about as this paper is written. So yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to add. I really appreciate the thoroughness of the conversation and, turning over of pretty much every rock from my perspective. Thanks.
Rich Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just would like to thank Julia and the SSC wholeheartedly for the amount of thought that went into this pre-white paper. At first blush, when this idea came to our attention, I was pretty skeptical, to be honest. But now having this outline to get me started on thinking about this, the more I think it's actually doable. So I'm very excited. I'm looking forward to seeing the white paper. My biggest question was how does the allocation going to be affected? But then, given this pre-paper, I realized it's pretty straightforward, and that isn't going to be affected all that much. So my fears there were kind of quelled. So anyway, thank you for that, the paper, the information, and I'm looking forward to seeing the white paper. Thanks.
Tony Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Paul and Julia have alluded to, I think this will have management implications that impact the joint nature of this FMP. So I hope that the next time this is discussed, it would be discussed with the commission so that the commissioners are not behind on this topic and are able to contribute to the conversation and direction that we move if the board and council want to make changes to the FMP.
Mike Penny.
Yeah, thanks. I recognize that one of Julia's earlier slides sort of setting the stage for this discussion was that the, council's expectation was to deal with the scientific possibilities first and then consider the legal implications later. And so, I guess the direction is going to be for the SSC to continue to write this white paper. But, I got to ask, is the council's intent to just continue to work on this in spite of the fact that it doesn't appear legal? Or do they want to have a conversation about the, potential legality of this approach before the SSC invests much more time in it?
Michelle.
No, I appreciate those concerns about legality. And I guess, speaking for myself, I would like to hear more about, from the services perspective, what the legal implications are, where are we stumbling when it comes to the legalities of, having of potentially, using a scientific basis for separation of these quantities. I guess I was picturing this in my head more that, the subgroup has done a lot of work. The SSC has done a lot of work. We can fill out the white paper based on this. And then I anticipated a go or no go type of decision, after the white paper was more complete, and would hope that, at that point, is there an appendix or something that could be produced that outlines what those legal concerns are with this type of approach? I mean, the way I see it, we are not in any way, shape, or form close to implementing something like this, but that just might be my perspective. I just think that, there are so many other external factors that could affect implementation of this type of approach, not the least of which is the legal piece, but, some of the other things that I mentioned and that, have been clearly raised in the information that we have thus far from a subgroup. Thanks.
Jim Gilmore.
Well, I have a question for Dr. Rago, but to your point, Mike, so I'm not trying to be too facetious. So was it the legality of it for the next 3.5 years may be very different than the legality of it after 4 years based upon the final decision that comes out of it because of what we're doing with laws and the administration right now? I mean, I don't want to get into it, but I mean, it's just wacky things are going on with legal interpretations right now. So again, I agree with you. It's from what I understand in Magnus and whatever, it's like it would be, it's probably not legal. But again, we'll see what happens with that. Should I go to my question with Dr. Rago, or do you want to do more on this?
Why don't you go ahead and answer, Mike, and then we'll.
Yeah, I mean, I can start, and John Almeida can address anything that I miss or get wrong. But I mean, first of all, you have National Standard 3, which says, stocks, management, you're going to manage the stocks as a unit. And so, we're looking at stocks that should be managed as a single unit, not subdivided. And then you look at the National Standard 1 guidelines, which are very clear when it the definitions of acceptable biological catch, or ABC, and ACLs is the total quantity of fish taken in commercial, recreational, subsistence, tribal, and other fisheries. So catch is all catch. Acceptable biological catch, or ABC, is the stock complex's annual catch. ACLs is the limit on the total annual catch of a stock or stock complex. And ACL may be divided into sector ACL. So that's the first use of or consideration of subdividing based on commercial versus recreational is at the sector ACL level. And that's what's in the current national standard guidelines. And so anything that tries to set separate ABCs for commercial or recreational, separate OFLs for commercial or recreational, just seems to fly in the face of NS3 and the National Standard 1 guidelines.
Jim, would you like to ask your question now?
Yep. Yeah. So this is just sort of a conceptual one to Dr. Rago. I'm just curious because this essentially is looking at separating the allocations or, between the recreational and commercial sectors. So, Paul, would it be possible to use the same process to look at allocations for things like state-by-state allocations, which is been a long problem we've had to deal with for those, particularly summer flounder and black sea bass. So again, a conceptual question. I don't think we should be going down that path, but just would this apply to doing something on a state-by-state allocation? Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Jim. First, call me Paul. Dr. Rago is far too formal. The second, under the current way the models are structured, it would not be possible to do it on a state-by-state basis. The reason I'm saying that is that the model structures now currently have selectivity patterns associated with the commercial and recreational fisheries. Those are distinct. If we were to so that's why it is allowable at the aggregate level. At the state level, the models are not structured in that same fashion, so you wouldn't have the parameters internal to the model that would allow that to occur. So I guess the short answer is that it would not be possible if, though, the aggregate recreational quantity were to change, then the proportions by state could be divvied up in the same way they are now, but it would not be something that's induced by the model structure per se. So I hope that's useful.
Thanks a lot, Paul. That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joe Zamino.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. To Mike Pentney's point, I wouldn't want to see this go too far down the line until we understood exactly, how we could make this work. But, I am interested, as Paul mentioned, the focus would be on summer flounder, scup, and sea bass. And I think there's probably a lot of work to understanding how this plays into the rec setting measures and what we're doing now with percent changes. And so, if the subgroup was, or the SSC in general, was spending time on those interactions, and as Paul mentioned, the idea of double counting uncertainty, then I think there's probably a lot of work to be done there, no matter, even if we move forward in a slightly different direction in the future. So I would be interested in that. Thanks.
Chris Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of things. So I think reflecting on the conversation today, Michelle captured it very well. We had an agreement. We agreed as a council that we'd have this white paper developed. It sounds like we're pretty close to having this white paper completed. Once that white paper was completed, then as a council, we would decide which steps to take, if any. That white paper, as Paul has presented today, might include an alternative that's outside of what we initially thought. So Paul, talked about something related to incorporating management uncertainty in a better way. Maybe that's something that we do. But I think it may be premature at this point to be talking about legality when we haven't had the complete white paper presented to us yet. So that's going to happen. The alternative is, if y'all want, today we can just say stop. Right? Stop. We've heard enough, and we're ready. Based on everything we know, we don't want to pursue this. But I think, again, getting back to Michelle's comments, we agreed for the development of a white paper. We're going to look at it this year and then decide if there's anything in that white paper that would trigger management action next year in terms of our 2026 implementation plan. So I think that's where we're at. And I would turn to Julia and Paul. How much more work are we talking about relative to the completion of the white paper? Can you just give us an idea? I mean, it seems, again, from my perspective, looking at the presentation, talking to you, Julia, that we're pretty close, but what is it? What's the answer?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak for the whole work group, but in the briefing materials, there was a suggestion that take what they've done so far, just kind of repackage it, bring it to the July SSC meeting, have the full SSC review it, and then potentially approve it. Then, like, assuming that all the subgroup members, have time to do that over the next month or so. But the way I was envisioning it was just packaging what's done right now. So I was imagining it wouldn't be that big of a workload, but I'll, defer to Paul if he thinks differently.
Yeah, I think you've captured it. I think if the council can sort of live with some of the indeterminacy of some of the tasking issues there, then we can put a bow on this thing fairly quickly, and by that I mean it would be similar to the presentation you received in the white paper. as currently structured, but it would not have the sort of specificity of tasks. So what how much anticipated workload would be needed by people at the center? What if a contractor is needed to evaluate the risk policy under this mixture of risk? What does that entail? And so forth. So I mean, there's pieces in there where there's some kind of like loose ends that possibly could be tied up, or at least. But I don't know if we're at the point where we'd say, okay, you need a contract of X amount of dollars for this period of time to address this mixture problem. So the white paper could get to the point of saying you need it, but it couldn't say how much is necessary.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. Thanks, Julia. So where we're at is basically, I think, Paul just said it. Put a bow on what we have, right? Don't get into the specifics. And I think that would serve the council well, at least from my perspective. And if anyone disagrees, now's the time to let Paul and Julia know. But certainly, we're almost there. Tell me what the next step is after the July SSC reviews the white paper. When does the council, and we get the board involved based on Tony's comments as well, when does the council and the board get a chance to look at that white paper and see what they want to do?
I think that was to be determined. We originally had it on a longer time frame, so the current list of planned council topics has it in December, but now we're at the point where we think we don't need to wait that long. So I know August is usually a busy meeting, but if it can be approved by the full SSC in July, and if it can fit on the August agenda, that's, there's lots of things with the commission's Summer Flounder Scup, like Sea Bass Management Board anyway, that, that's possible if it could fit on the agenda. But right now it's on the draft schedule for December, which is also with the commission.
Rich Wong.
I agree with with Chris Moore's assessment here. Let's move forward with this white paper, given how close we are to the finish line. But Mr. Pentney's comments are not trivial. We need to grapple with that sooner than later. But there are obvious management benefits to going this route. And I think, let's see what the white paper has to say. I'm in favor of continuing with this and seeing what the white paper has to say. I think in with respect to his concerns with NS 1 and 3, I think nothing has changed. This is still one unit. We're still obviously still managing as one unit, and it's just a naming thing. We could call it something other than an ABC, sector specific ABC. I mean, so I think we can get around those things, but I do want to have that discussion here. Thanks.
Is there anyone from the council that disagrees with moving forward with the white paper? Seeing none, I think Julia and Dr. Rago, you have a game plan. And again, we're going to put that on the 2025 AW calendar.
Easy for you to say.
Exactly. All right, we're a little bit behind on time, so let's move on to our next topic, the offshore wind monitoring standards update. We're receiving a presentation to provide an update on the Science Center's effort to develop offshore wind monitoring standards and request input from the council. Elizabeth, Chris, and Angela, not sure what the order is going to be. So whenever you guys are ready, and just let us know who wants to start.
Hello, Mr. Chair. Thank you, everyone. This is Elizabeth Mathrada. I will be getting us started. Is it best for you to present the slides?
We can do either way.
Okay. It looks like I can't share content, so maybe it's best for you all, maybe it's the simplest for you all to present the PDF.
We're ready to go when you are.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. This is Elizabeth Mathrada from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. I'm happy to be with you all this morning. Today, we would like to present an update on our efforts to develop offshore wind monitoring standards. As I'm getting started, I would like to acknowledge all of my colleagues on this slide from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center and the greater as well as the regional office, who really spearheaded the development of these standards. There are also many other colleagues we have at the Science Center who provided input and expertise into the various sections of the standards. Next slide, please. Just an overview of our presentation today. First, I will begin by giving some background and purpose. What are we doing and why are we doing it? Will be described in this section. Then I will move on to talk about some specifics of the fisheries species monitoring standards, providing a fairly high-level overview of those standards. Then I will pass it off to my Science Center colleague, Chris Orphanides, who will present an overview of the protected species monitoring standards. And then we'll pass it to Angela Silva, our colleague at the Science Center, who will talk about socioeconomic monitoring standards. Next slide, please. So I'm sure, as most of you are aware, offshore wind development is occurring in the Northeast U.S. continental shelf ecosystem. As part of their preparations and their development plans, wind developers are responsible for monitoring their individual wind projects to assess impacts. This map shows the various offshore wind energy areas that are in this region. The project level environmental monitoring is required by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the proponent of offshore wind here in our system in the US. And this monitoring is to evaluate the effects of wind development on the physical, biological, and socioeconomic resources, as well as bottom seafloor habitat that occurs because of wind development. Next slide, please. So although there is this requirement to conduct monitoring, there is not really any requirements for how monitoring should be conducted or what should be monitored. There are existing monitoring guidelines for fishery species that are available from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, most recently updated in 2023, and from the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance, or ROSA, that came out in 2021. But despite the presence of these, the availability of these guidelines, they have not yet led to standardized monitoring across projects. There's also no monitoring standards available for protected species, with perhaps the exception of passive acoustic monitoring requirements. There's also no monitoring standards for oceanographic conditions or socioeconomic conditions. So as things stand currently, there are some monitoring guidelines, but no no standardized monitoring across projects. Next slide, please. So the impetus for our efforts to develop monitoring standards comes from the NOAA Fisheries and BOEM Federal Survey Mitigation Strategy, in which an objective was defined, Objective 2.1, to develop and apply regional standards and requirements to wind energy development, project-specific monitoring, and data accessibility. So this is really what led to us undertaking this effort. Next slide, please. Here, when we talk about wind project, we're talking about an individual wind farm or wind project. The scope of the monitoring standards for the biological elements are focused on fixed foundation wind projects. These have a specific set of impact producing factors. So we're really focused on fixed foundation for the biological components. The socioeconomic components of the monitoring standards are also focused on fixed foundation wind projects, although they do have applicability to floating offshore wind infrastructure as well. Notably, there may be multiple wind projects in a lease area, and there may be multiple lease areas in a wind energy area. Next slide, please. The geographic region that we're focusing on for the monitoring standards, which I have in quotation the term region, we're focusing here on essentially the yellow polygon south of Cape Cod, including southern New England and the mid-Atlantic bight portions of the Northeast U.S. continental shelf ecosystem. This is where fixed foundation offshore wind structures have been placed and are being placed. Next slide, please. As I noted, wind developer-led monitoring is currently not standardized. A couple of years ago, some colleagues and I underwent a summary of the existing monitoring plans that were available for review at that time. 9 different monitoring for 9 different offshore wind projects were available at that time to review. And what we found was that there were major differences in the questions that were addressed, the indicators that were proposed to be measured, the sampling methods and design proposed to be used, the gear type, the duration of baseline and of post-construction data collection, and the methods proposed for information sharing. So from that, we found that standardized methods were not being used, but they were needed. Next slide, please. So why do we need to have standardized monitoring? The idea here is to employ consistent methods, sampling gear, study designs, etc., when addressing a given question in an offshore wind project, and that this would be able to enable the integration of data across wind projects and the evaluation of regional scale changes in populations, which is the scale over which our populations actually occur. So we would be able to have these data be able to be integratable so that we could also inform fisheries management decisions and understand how populations are being affected over these broad regional scales. Next slide, please. So the purpose of our effort is to develop recommended project level monitoring standards for developers to use to conduct long-term monitoring at offshore wind projects, to evaluate interactions between offshore wind development and the marine ecosystem. This would include physical, biological, and socioeconomic components of the ecosystem. So this would essentially be sort of a guidebook for developers to follow to collect these data in a way that are informative from a fisheries management perspective. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the key elements of the monitoring standards. There's 11 items listed here. Each one of these is described for each of the areas of monitoring in the monitoring standards. The first is that each of these topic areas, we define a hypothesis or question or set of questions. We identify focal species or fishing communities or indicators that we recommend be monitored. The third thing is that we make recommendations for the collection of sufficient baseline data, as well as we define the spatial and temporal scales, particularly that are relevant to the question or hypothesis being addressed. We define standard methods and approaches to be used across individual fixed foundation projects, including sampling gear and instrumentation, sampling platforms, sampling design and data elements. We make recommendations related to using appropriate sample sizes and statistical power for each of the response variables of interest, as well as applying valid statistical methods to quantify changes. We make a recommendation to establish and carry out a plan for data storage, access, information sharing, and public data accessibility. We make a recommendation to define performance indices and establish a schedule for evaluating monitoring plan performance. That is the monitoring collecting data that is telling us the information that we're hoping to get from it. And then if not, we need to review the performance of the monitoring program and use meaningful metrics to evaluate its performance, and as needed, adapt the monitoring to improve performance as needed. And then the 11th element is to identify interconnections with other offshore wind data collections, such as data collected for survey mitigation and data collected to evaluate other impacts, so that we can potentially leverage one stream of data to inform other streams of data as well. Next slide, please. So we have a number of questions identified in the monitoring standards, and so one follow-up from that might be, what monitoring questions should developers focus on? And this is really to highlight that developers would not be expected to address all questions in the monitoring standards at their project, but we would ask that they would address some of the questions in the monitoring standards at their respective projects using the approaches outlined in the monitoring standards. Next slide, please. And this is to highlight, again, the adaptive monitoring approach, where right now we're in the design phase. We apply the monitoring standards in real time, in real life, and then we learn about what the effects are and how our monitoring approaches are performing. And then we have a chance to go back to potentially redesign or improve our monitoring approaches to enhance performance, and then going around in sort of this cycle of adaptive monitoring to learn, redesign, and apply the monitoring in the hope to gather and collect the information that we want to gather. Next slide, please. So next I'll move on to talking about the fishery species monitoring standards, providing an overview of this component of the monitoring standards. Next slide, please. So the monitoring standard for fishery species covers several impact producing factors. This is a term used by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to describe the factors that emanate from offshore wind development that potentially impact or change the physical, biological, economic, or cultural components of the ecosystem. I have them just sort of listed here. The fishery species monitoring standards are aimed at looking at the effects of noise, hydrodynamics, artificial reef effects, electromagnetic field effects, and also the cumulative effects of wind development on movement and behavior of species. Next slide, please. So at a high level, the goal of the monitoring standards to evaluate noise is to understand the effect of noise on the movement and behavior of fishery species, considering geological and geophysical survey noise, construction noise, and operational noise. Here, the methodologies would use acoustic tagging and telemetry to monitor the movement and behavior of individuals of an indicator species in response to these sources of noise due to offshore wind development. Next slide, please. For hydrodynamics, the goal of the monitoring would be to understand the effects of changes in the distribution and abundance of the eggs and larvae of fishery species due to broad-scale wind wake effects. This is the change in the alteration of atmospheric dynamics that have an effect on water current speed and direction and stratification of the water column, and how that affects eggs and larvae of fishery species over relatively broad scales, potentially tens of kilometers. Also looking at the effects of turbine scale effects on oceanography and how that affects fisheries species, and also the effects of heated water discharge and oceanographic changes that occur at HVDC or high voltage direct current converter stations that are used for wind developments that are 30 miles or more from the shore. So the methods used there would be to use similar methodologies. Oh, if you could go back one slide. To use similar methodologies that are used for the ecosystem monitoring survey that's conducted by the Northeast Fisheries Science Center to sample zooplankton using the EcoMon methods, and then monitoring changes in oceanographic patterns, water column stratification, currents, etc., using other oceanographic instrumentation that Chris will talk about later in the presentation. Next slide, please. For artificial reef effects, the goal would be to understand how the presence of artificial reefs affect biological indices for fisheries species, considering epibenthos on turbine foundations and on scour protection materials, fish species around foundations, scour protection, and over soft substrate, epibenthos and in fauna on soft sediment near foundations, soft sediment composition and chemistry, as well as contaminants, chemical contaminants from corrosion protection materials in soft sediment and in fish tissue. Here, the methodologies would include a combination of optical instrumentation, active acoustics, eDNA, and physical sampling so that we could actually collect individuals to evaluate biological measurements such as size, sex, maturity, condition, and diet, for example. Next slide, please. For the electromagnetic fields component of the monitoring standards, the goal would be to understand the effect of electromagnetic fields, or EMFs, on fisheries species movements and behavior, with a focus on understanding both intra-array and export cables. The cables, when energized, emit electromagnetic fields. And so we'd be using acoustic tagging and telemetry with arrays designed in such a way that the movement and behavior of tagged individuals could be studied around the cables when they're energized, to see if there are effects and what those effects might be. Next slide, please. And then the last one I'll mention is the cumulative effects on movement and behavior. The goal here in the monitoring standards would be to understand how wind development cumulatively affects the movement and behavior of fisheries species. Here, again, tagging and telemetry would be used to evaluate movement and behavior of fishery species. That is to say, when are these species present in the wind energy area? How long do they stay? When do they leave? Those sorts of questions to understand sort of these overarching cumulative effects of wind development on the movement and behavior of these species. Next slide, please. At this time, I'd like to pass the mic over to my colleague, Chris Orphanides from the Science Center, who will talk about protected species monitoring standards.
Thank you, Lisa. As Lisa said, I'm Chris Orphanides. I work with Lisa and Angela in the Science Center, and I'm the protected species lead for our marine development ecology branch. Next slide, please. So why are we interested in monitoring for protected species? From our point of view, we're charged with managing these species under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and Endangered Species Act. But as far as it relates to you guys with more fisheries concerns, there's several other reasons this could be of interest to you. A lot of our concerns are more focused on habitat changes and changes that could be relevant to fisheries as well as protected species. So habitat changes, as Lisa mentioned, potential changes in oceanography that could influence a broader system, and then also marine mammals' influence on the larger ecosystem given their distribution and abundance. Next slide. And so these are the topics I'll touch on briefly today. There is some overlap with the fisheries IPFs impact producing factors that Lisa mentioned. So noise is the first one, how it affects distribution, abundance, behavior, condition, injury, mortality. Similarly to fisheries, again, we have monitoring of movement, behavior, and distribution. This is for protected species. And when I'm talking about protected species here, it's primarily marine mammals and sea turtles, but there's also some protected fish issues. So in the sturgeon would be the primary one in this area, although there may be others. Next one is vessel strikes and entanglement. And the last one is altered hydrodynamics, which Lisa touched on too. Next slide. So the first one for noise. So we're looking at how noise will affect the distribution, abundance and behavior, condition and injury, mortality. And so for this, the primary tool is passive acoustic monitoring for the noise aspect directly. But to look at the behavior and the abundance and other aspects, there's also could use telemetry, satellite tags, and aerial and shipboard surveys. So what we hope to do with this is establish baselines for soundscape first in the region. And then once we have that, we can assess the potential impacts. And along the way, through these monitoring standards, we hope to establish standards and repositories for the data. And this is something the Science Center has made a bit of progress on already. On the right is just a screenshot of the Science Center's PACM website. This is a website anybody can access that has an online acoustic database for detections of marine mammals. So it's a pretty handy data set and a website where you could make you can kind of cut the data as you want and make some figures and things as seen on the left-hand side. Next slide. And as I mentioned, the Science Center has made some progress on the passive acoustic monitoring front. In particular, Sophie Van Paris, along with some BOEM colleagues, put together minimum recommendations, so some guidelines for passive acoustic monitoring to be employed specifically for offshore wind development. So that was a paper published a couple of years ago. And so we have some good foundations for standards in place. And then also in coordination with BOEM, Power On program, where there's required offshore wind lessees to conduct long-term monitoring on their lease areas with PAM and measure sound levels to monitor the presence of vocalizing marine species. Next slide. And so this slide here is on movement, behavior, and distribution. So primarily marine mammals and sea turtles, and some with protected fish as well. So different methods involved here could be aerial surveys, vessel surveys, passive acoustic monitoring itself can get some sense of movement and behavior as well, and tagging. So together, I hope to get a baseline data for the abundance and distribution and examine potential changes. And so some methods that we are proposing would include aerial surveys. For that, we'd be defining the sampling platform and sampling design, passive acoustic monitoring, which we've already discussed, and potentially tagging, although that would require extensive consultation with experts. It's a little bit difficult to provide exact standards for that in many cases. Next slide. So this one's on vessel strike, entanglement, and incidental capture. And the incidental capture here could include fisheries studies for offshore wind assessment. So here we're just mostly trying to make sure we have consistent evaluation of these sorts of mortalities or interactions. So we'd outline the best practices that are consistent with NOAA fisheries existing protocols. So we want to make sure that any potential impacts from offshore wind development are attributed to the development rather than another cause. Next slide. And this is the last one I'll talk about today, just the altered hydrodynamics. You can see a figure there on the right from the paper from Durrell et al. That shows potential changes due to offshore wind impacts. So we have potential impacts from wakes from the turbine structures themselves, and then the wind wakes that Lisa described as far as extracting atmospheric energy from the system that could alter the surface, alter the oceanographic, the currents and things and stratification and things of that nature. So some considerations for monitoring is fixed versus mobile gear, so moored sampling versus vehicle-based sampling, spatial and temporal scales, what ones are best to assess these changes with. We could also use remote sensing. And we have been doing some work on in this regard, although it's not directly for these monitoring standards. We have some plans in place to put some bottom moorings down. We've also been doing some sampling with uncrewed vehicles. And so some things to monitor is potential changes in upwelling and downwelling. So there could form some dipoles in the lee of these wind farms. Changes in frontal eddy dynamics, stratification changes in time and space, and zooplankton and phytoplankton dynamics, so changes in species and abundance and the densities of these animals. And so the protected species aspect of this is primarily to examine distribution of marine mammal and sea turtle prey as far as zooplankton, changing with the presence of offshore wind development. And just one quick thing, because it came up in a question earlier, we are funding some modeling studies to look at this, BOEM and NOAA together. So it's in year one of the project, and hopefully we can have funding to continue through it. It would be a 3-year project. Next slide. And that's it for protected species for me. And next up would be Angela Silva to talk about socioeconomics.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Angela Silva. I'm a social scientist at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. Next slide. So we define socioeconomic monitoring as the collection of data to track change over time in fisheries socioeconomic conditions in response to offshore wind before as baseline and through all phases of development. We're considering the scope of the monitoring conditions as individuals, fleets, and communities in both commercial and recreational fishing. Offshore wind may affect a number of social factors, including fishing behavior, business operations, demographics and employment, relationships and networks, costs and revenues, attitudes and perceptions. Despite these anticipated effects on fisheries and fishing communities, to date, there's no comprehensive socioeconomic monitoring guidelines or monitoring generally to date. So there's a clear and urgent need to establish a framework for socioeconomic monitoring. Next slide, please. So the impact producing factors that we identified that were relevant for social impacts. So these 3 on the screen here have been identified in the literature and through offshore wind processes as critical factors to understand the scope of human impacts. So these are the structure presence, considering the impacts associated with the physical presence of onshore or offshore structures, such as turbines or substations, installation and maintenance activities, and disturbances associated with installing and maintaining cables and turbines, as well as accidental releases is covered under that A. And we also looked at traffic and port utilization as well, including any port activity upgrades or maintenance that occur due to development. Next slide, please. So recognizing that the effects on human systems is complex, so for monitoring purposes and to provide a clearer visualization of the relationships, we structured the socioeconomic standards using a conceptual illustration for each of the 3 IPFs. So each of the IPFs would be represented in that orange box. And we used this tiered approach, differentiating between direct or tier 1 in the dark gray box there, and indirect tier 2 in the light gray. So there could be relationships between direct and indirect elements, obviously, but as well as within and between those indirects. Those are the arrows in between each other all the way to the right as well. So this tiered approach we felt allows for prioritization of monitoring efforts, and it can also help further understand and differentiate cumulative and concomitant impacts of offshore wind or the effects that would naturally accompany other impacts. So we recommend that tier 1 elements should be prioritized in monitoring efforts to increase the chances that cause and effect relationships are well understood. And then monitoring programs should be designed including both tier 1 and tier 2, but tier 2 elements should be prioritized once information and data for tier 1 indicators are available. So that offers sort of a prioritization that we want to make sure we're definitely collecting the direct impact information. So this will allow for better understanding of the relationships between those. Next slide. So we began identifying those gray boxes, the dark and the light gray boxes, those elements. We identified, defined, and scoped those direct and indirect elements by working from previous collaborative research efforts in the region that may or may not be aware of, but these identified potential impacts from regional researchers and also included direct input from the fishing industry on offshore wind impacts. So that included the synthesis of the science, which is a few years old now, but it provides a comprehensive review of the impacts that we drew from. With industry input and review of that document. Also, the fisheries and floating offshore wind integrated ecosystem assessment, both are linked there. And so that identified impacts as well in an ecosystem context, and we had 3 workshops with fishing industry for those. So although we drew from these existing efforts that collected knowledge on these issues, we recognize the importance of having direct input on these guidelines to make sure that we're identifying the right elements in a monitoring context. We aren't missing anything and we're asking the right questions. So we're working on organizing a strategy for obtaining fishing industry input into these standards directly. So so that should be forthcoming, and we welcome any suggestions on methods of doing so as well. Next slide, please. So we won't have time to go through all the models, but we did want to provide an example here today. So we chose the structure presence as an example. So for this, for example, the tier 1 or those direct impacts, we've identified that fishable area and access, gear interactions, and navigations. Those are 3 direct impacts from the physical presence of structures such as a turbine array. And then next slide, please. All of these boxes within our report are defined in more detail, and then the specific relationships you see in these arrows that we've identified are also described in the report. So I'll zoom in and walk through one relationship today as an example that looks at how offshore wind energy development may affect revenue and cost, and what information and indicators are needed to monitor that effect. Next slide, please. So that would be, so the structure of presence, say, will directly affect the fishing access. So everything that's sort of bright, everything else is grayed out. So this is that relationship here. So the ability or inability to access fishing grounds will indirectly affect fishing operations and practices, or what we're calling fisheries attributes there, which includes things like fishing effort, landings, and species composition changes, and how those changes will affect revenue and costs. Next slide, please. So just to zoom in on just those relationships here. So we've identified for each, again, of these pathways here, a set of indicators and methods for each. So we've highlighted some indicators on this slide here. So for a fishable area, and again, this dark gray would be stuff that we are recommending absolutely would need to be, information would need to be monitored and collected on this. That would be things like indicators of frequency of the regulatory spatial exclusions. This effect includes both legal restrictions, say during construction activities, but also gear type restrictions, or the inability of fishing vessels to deploy gear. So changes in space use and density of fishing, and then you can just click to the next slide. And then so once you have all that information and data collected, you would also want to collect information on the fisheries attributes and some of the indicators we're recommending. Again, all this is detailed more in the report, but things like changes in fishing effort, number and size of vessels fishing, changes in catch size composition, home port, landing ports, those changes. And then one more click. And then that will help understand revenue and cost and trip costs and revenues associated with the changes there. Next slide, please. So again, given the time of this presentation, I won't go through all of these models, but so we have the same sort of structure or framework for the other two IFPF. So this being the traffic one, again, detailed more in the reports, but we have a set of indicators, methods, and any research that's needed. We understand that data does not exist for all of these things, so that's also part of the effort that we're undergoing here is identifying those. So same for traffic and changes in space use and safety, and then sort of the same set of tier 2, but different relationships with this IPF. And then next slide, my last one. And same for port utilization. So again, more details in the report, but that is the socioeconomic standards summary there. And I'll go to the next slide. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa to wrap up.
Thank you, Angela. With this last slide, we wanted to state that we welcome council feedback on the monitoring standards. We anticipate having a draft document available by mid-July. If the council are interested and have availability to provide feedback, we would welcome that. Particularly, among other things, the topics for specific feedback from the council would include questions such as, do the monitoring standards address the right questions, and will the monitoring standards collect information that will meet the council's needs when evaluating changes in marine resources and fishing operations and related to offshore wind energy projects? And we would ask to have feedback by this fall, later this year. With that, I think I will stop and pass the mic back to you all and see if there are any comments or questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth, Chris, and Angela. Is there any comments or questions or feedback? Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and many thanks to you, Liz, and everyone else who contributed to the presentation. Really appreciate the thoroughness with which you all went through this. I guess, one of my questions is, and I think I mentioned this when we first heard about the development of these standards, I believe, late last year or earlier this year, was, what level of, I guess, maybe coordination or collaboration have you all had, with ROSA, understanding that the guidelines that ROSA initially developed have not necessarily led to project level monitoring standards, but I know that they did have a couple of interns this past summer that were working on some of these issues. Like they did have an intern working on socioeconomic information. So I guess the first question is just the level of collaboration with ROSA on development of these standards, particularly given some of their efforts to date, including things like data governance, as well as the RWSC Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative. Thank you.
This is Elizabeth. Thank you for that question. What I can say is that we have shared that we are developing these monitoring standards with ROSA, so they are aware of our efforts to develop this. We have, I think Chris and I are both members of RWSC subcommittees, as well as Jordan Katz, who's not able to join us today, who works on the protected fish species RWSC subcommittee. And I don't know if Angela, you want to speak about the socioeconomic component that ROSA was working on. I don't know that we have specifically coordinated with the with the work that the interns did at ROSA. I was aware that they had some efforts underway. But I was not, I don't believe that we necessarily coordinated this effort with them. But Rosa is, and I don't know if Mike is on, but they know that we've been working on this for some time. I don't know, Chris or Angela, if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can go really quickly. This is Chris. I'm also, so we're involved with some of the subcommittees. I'm also on the steering committee, so of the RWSC. So they're aware of these efforts, and we're kind of in touch as they're become developed, and they mostly there could be a little bit of overlap. A lot of their work seems to be a little more focused on the research end of things rather than strictly monitoring. But although they are directly involved with the power on process, so we're happy to have their involvement. So there's good communication between us and them with regards to these monitoring standards.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman, just quickly. Thank you. So thanks for that. I really appreciate that response. And I guess the other thing that struck me is there are, between the different categories of, fisheries and protected species and socioeconomic monitoring. So for example, there's some overlap between fisheries and protected species in terms of, monitoring for hydrodynamic effects, and I guess maybe just encourage coordination there so that there's, one suite of, hydrodynamic factors that would be presented, to developers down the road for monitoring, so that they're not just divided up amongst these different, the standards for these different, different pieces. So that's just one suggestion. Thanks.
Thank you
Yeah.
for that. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Either one. Go ahead, Lisa.
You were probably going to say what I was going to say, which is that the way the monitoring standards are organized is by the impact producing factors. And so within those sections, we tried as much as was suggested to align the methods and the response variables so that we were proposing the same methods to monitor the same things when the same variables were relevant to a particular question, such as you noted, the hydrodynamics being important for changes in some aspects of fisheries, species, and aspects of protected species. Sorry, Chris, didn't mean to cut you off, but.
No, that's great. Yeah. So the way the draft document is set up, there's only one chapter for hydrodynamics. So there's just, and perhaps we didn't portray it very well in the presentation, but so it's pretty well coordinated there. I think like Lisa said, we can use the same methods that would get at either fisheries or protected species issues. For example, if we're looking at ichthyoplankton distribution versus zooplankton, a lot of the same or similar methods. So is more to highlight the concerns from a protected species standpoint.
Great. Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Chris Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the slide here indicates, we don't have the document yet. Once that document is available, we'll make it available to the council, and or either develop comments for the council through email, or we can do it that way, or we can have another discussion about the document in August and bundle up the comments after that in time for that deadline for fall 2025. Does that sound like something y'all want to do? Okay, we'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And with that, I think we're getting ready to break for lunch, but I have one quick announcement from Chris.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, we are getting ready to break for lunch. We have the reception tonight on Skip's boat. So as I understand it, Skip, the boat leaves the dock at 6 o'clock. Yeah. Let's say 6 o'clock. Yeah. So everyone try to be there by 5:45 so we can get settled and we can actually leave by by 6, to facilitate everything, to get to make sure that we don't have to deal with payment on board for the reception tonight. Shelley's going to be taking your payment at lunchtime, so see Shelley about that. And I think with that, to get there, we need an address, right? Skip, everybody's on their own. Folks, obviously, if you can carpool, that'd be great. There's a trolley that goes up and down the street, but I don't know exactly what the trolley schedule is. Maybe Shelley does. And, or Uber. Uber's always good. Yeah.
And so Chris and I were just talking about this. I have a large vehicle. I can take 7 people myself. So I'll have the car outside ready to go if people want to hop in with me. Make sure everybody gets back and forth safely. So it's up to you.
Okay. So with that, questions about tonight? Okay. Seeing none. Thanks.
Yep. Seeing none, let's come back at 1:15 for chub mackerel.
Chub, it's Julia's favorite species.
She's going to have a hard time getting rid of that.